He built an empire on blood and silence. He threw away the one woman who loved him for nothing, and for 15 months a little boy grew up without a father, while that father didn't even know he existed. Tonight, everything Damien Viscari thought he'd buried comes back in a single phone call. And the man who has never begged for anything in his life is about to get on his knees, not for power, not for money, but for the son he never knew he had. Stay with this story until the very end. If it reaches you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came in sideways off the Hudson. It had been building since mid-afternoon, the kind of slow-gathering storm that pressed down on the city like a fist, turning the air thick and electric before it finally broke. By 8 o'clock, it was a full assault. Sheets of water hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damien Viscari's penthouse on the 53rd floor. Lightning fracturing the skyline every few minutes. Thunder rolling through the canyon streets below like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Damien stood at the window with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. 41 years old, 6'2", the kind of build that came from discipline rather than vanity. Dark hair cut close, a jaw that had taken its share of hits and kept its shape. He wore a charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, no tie, no jacket. The tie had come off at 6, the jacket at 6:15. He had 7 missed calls from Marcus Trell, his head of operations, and a dinner he'd canceled 40 minutes ago with the deputy mayor of New York, a man whose entire political career Damien had quietly financed for the better part of a decade. None of that registered right now. What registered was the storm, and the particular quality of the silence inside the penthouse, the kind of silence that cost a great deal of money to construct and felt, tonight, less like peace and more like a held breath. He lifted the bourbon, set it back down. Behind him, the apartment was immaculate in the way of spaces that are cleaned by professionals and lived in by no one in particular. 1,800 square feet of Italian marble, hand-selected art, custom furniture that had been arranged by a designer whose name Damien had already forgotten. There were no photographs on the walls. There were no photographs anywhere in the apartment, a fact that had taken him several months to notice and which he had not examined too closely since. His phone lit up on the kitchen island. Marcus again. Damien let it ring. He had made $400 million in the legitimate half of his portfolio this fiscal year. The other half, the half that existed in handshakes and offshore accounts and the careful, patient cultivation of fear, had made considerably more. He ran a network that touched every serious family operation from Boston to Miami, not as a boss in the old theatrical sense, but as the man every boss needed to stay solvent. He was the infrastructure. He was the silence behind the silence. Men who understood the world as it actually functioned came to Damien Viscari when they needed things resolved, and things were resolved, and the money moved, and New York kept turning. He was, by any honest measure, untouchable. He stood at the window and watched the rain destroy the city, and felt, as he had been feeling with increasing frequency over the past several months, absolutely nothing. His private phone rang. Not the business line, not the number Marcus had. The number known to fewer than a dozen people in the world, a string of digits that had never been written down anywhere and was changed every 8 weeks. Damien had answered it 1,000 times, and it had always been one of those 11 people. The screen read, "Unknown number." He stared at it through 2 full rings, then he picked up. "Viscari." His standard answer, flat, positioned, giving nothing. A sound on the other end. Not speech, something rougher than speech, breathing that had been broken apart and was trying to reassemble itself. He heard it and felt something in his chest tighten on pure animal instinct before his brain had processed a single word. "Elena." He said it without deciding to. A pause. Then, "Yes." Her voice was wrong. He had not heard Elena Rowan's voice in 15 months, not since the night he'd signed the divorce papers at the Four Seasons in front of witnesses he'd chosen for the specific purpose of making the severance public and final. He had not called her after. She had not called him. That had been the arrangement. Not spoken, but understood the way only two people who had genuinely loved each other and then genuinely destroyed it could understand something. But he knew her voice the way he knew his own heartbeat, and what he was hearing right now had been taken apart by something terrible. "Elena, talk to me." She stopped. He heard her inhale, the jagged intake of someone who has been crying hard and is trying to stop. "I didn't want to call you. I need you to know that. I tried every other option first." "What happened?" "I need you to come to Boston." His spine went rigid. "Tell me what happened." "Boston General Hospital." Her voice cracked on the second word, cracked and held. "You need to come now, Damien, tonight." "Elena, our son is dying." The room went very still. He heard the rain. He heard his own pulse, which had done something strange and structural, like a building settling on its foundation after an earthquake. "What son?" he said. The words came out wrong. He heard it, not a question, more like a man reaching for solid ground and finding air, her breath on the line, wet and wrecked. "His name is Noah," she said. "He's 14 months old, and he is your son. And he is in the ICU, and I need you to come right now, please." The please broke her. He heard it happen. Damien's hand had gone to the kitchen island without him telling it to, palm flat against the marble, grounding himself against a world that had just reorganized itself into something he didn't recognize. "I'm coming," he said. He hung up. He looked at nothing for 4 seconds. Then he called his pilot. The helicopter cut through the storm at 11,000 feet, the turbulence bad enough that the co-pilot kept glancing back at him, reading the situation, trying to determine whether the passenger was going to demand they turn around. Damien sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them and stared at the deck plating. He was doing the math. 15 months since the divorce. The divorce itself had taken 4 months, so 19 months since the last time they had been together as husband and wife in any real sense. 14 months since the child's birth. The timeline fit. It fit the way something fits when you don't want it to, when part of you is still looking for the error in the calculation and finding none. He tried to remember what he knew about the last months of his marriage. What he remembered was Kara Stanton. Damien pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes. Kara Stanton had been 32, a derivatives trader at a firm his holding company had been in the process of acquiring, and she had been stunning in the particular way of women who know exactly what they're doing and have decided to do it. And he had known, standing at a charity gala on the 38th floor of a building he owned, that he was looking at a mistake. He'd known it with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that comes right before a person decides to do something anyway. Elena had found out at 6 weeks. She hadn't screamed. That was the thing he'd carried with him. She hadn't screamed or thrown things or done any of the things that would have allowed him to build a counter-narrative. She had looked at him across the kitchen of their townhouse in the West Village with an expression that was completely and devastatingly calm, and she had said, "I think we both know what this is." And then she had walked upstairs and he had stood in the kitchen, understanding that the marriage was over and that it was over because of something he had chosen and that there was nothing to be done about it now. He'd made it worse. That was the thing he'd never quite admitted in the privacy of his own skull, and which he admitted now in the shaking dark of a helicopter over a storm-soaked Massachusetts coastline. He'd made it worse because some part of him, the part that controlled things, that structured situations to his advantage, that had learned very young that the best way to survive something painful was to make it clean and final and move, had decided that a slow withdrawal was more dangerous than a surgical cut. So he'd filed first. He'd requested the Four Seasons meeting, the witnesses, the very public severing. He told himself it was efficiency. He told himself Elena would eventually be grateful for the clarity. What he'd actually done, he understood now, was make it impossible for a pregnant woman to come to him. He sat in the helicopter and understood this with a coldness that had nothing to do with the altitude. Boston General was a fortress of fluorescent light in the rain-soaked dark. His pilot set down on the rooftop pad at 12 minutes past 10, and Damien was moving before the rotors had fully spun down, his suit jacket darkening instantly in the downpour, a hospital administrator meeting him at the stairwell door with the expression of someone who had been told exactly who was arriving and was working very hard to be professional about it. Mr. Vescari, Dr. Anand asked me to bring you directly. Where's Elena Rowan? Not a question. PICU, Pediatric Intensive. Take me there. They moved through the hospital at a pace that made the administrator's low heels click in rapid time, down a service elevator, through a corridor of muted beige that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air and something else beneath it, the particular institutional smell of a place where people fought to stay alive. Damien cataloged everything, the number of security cameras, the placement of staff, the layout, because that was what his brain did under stress. It mapped, it assessed, it looked for exits and leverage points even when the thing it was actually doing was trying not to come apart. The pediatric intensive care unit was through a set of wide double doors that required a badge swipe. The administrator had one. He used it and held the door, and Damien walked through. The first thing he saw was Elena. She was sitting in a plastic chair beside a door on the left side of the corridor, still wearing what looked like the clothes she'd been working in. Dark slacks, a gray blouse with the collar button undone, a blazer that had been wadded up into a makeshift pillow beside her, which she clearly hadn't used. Her hair was down. She'd always worn it up for work. He knew that without knowing how he knew it. Down, it fell to her shoulders, dark and slightly waved, and it was tangled now and damp at the edges from the rain she must have walked through getting here. She was 34 years old. She looked older tonight, not in a failing way, but in the way of someone who has been carrying a great deal of weight for a long time and stopped pretending it wasn't heavy. She saw him. She stood up. They looked at each other across 12 feet of corridor. There were things that needed to be said, and neither of them said any of them. "How is he?" Damien said. "Stable. As of an hour ago, stable." Her voice was steadier than it had been on the phone. Steadiness she had built herself, in this chair, in this corridor, over however many hours she'd been here. "Bacterial meningitis. They caught it." She stopped, restarted. "They caught it in time. They think. Show me." She turned without another word and pushed open the door. The room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of monitors and the ambient light from the corridor window. The sounds were the sounds of machines doing the work that a small body was too exhausted to do alone. The rhythmic compression of a ventilator, the soft percussion of a heart monitor, the quiet hiss of an IV drip. The bed was very small. The boy in it was smaller. Damien stopped 2 steps inside the door. 14 months old. He hadn't known until this moment that he didn't actually know what 14 months looked like, what that size meant, what that scale was, how completely and devastatingly small a human being could be. The child was on his back, arms loose at his sides, a thicket of wires and tubes mapping the territory of his tiny chest. Dark hair. The fine, soft, dark hair of infancy. A face that was flushed with the particular high color of fever, cheeks too red, lips dry despite the fluid lines running into his arm. He was beautiful, and he was covered in bruises. Damien saw them as his eyes adjusted to the dim. A fading yellow-purple band along the left forearm, a cluster of small dark marks at the child's jawline, a discoloration at the temple. The kind of bruising that didn't come from a single incident, the kind of bruising that accumulated. Something happened to the inside of Damien's chest that he had no name for. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched beside the bed. Up close, he could see the boy's face more clearly. The way the child's brows were drawn together slightly even in sleep, some distress still working through him beneath consciousness. Tucked against his right side, wedged between his arm and his ribs, was a stuffed rabbit. Gray and worn to near formlessness at the ears, one button eye replaced with a mismatched plastic bead, the kind of beloved that only comes from a year of daily contact. Damien reached out and very gently, more gently than he'd touched anything in his adult life, cupped the child's chin with 2 fingers. The boy stirred, his eyes opened, clouded and unfocused from fever and medication, dark eyes that found Damien's face and stayed there in the unspecific way of very young children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "Hey!"
Damien said. His voice came out wrecked. The boy blinked, didn't look away. Damien felt his jaw lock down hard. "Who did this to you?" He said it barely above a whisper, through his teeth, not to the child. The child was 14 months old, but to the room, to the situation, to whoever was responsible for the marks on this boy's skin. Elena spoke from the doorway behind him. "His name is Noah." "I know his name." Damien stayed where he was, looking at his son. "You told me." A silence. "You can sit down," Elena said. Her tone was careful, neutral in the way that neutral takes effort to produce. "I don't want to sit down." "Damien, who put those marks on him?" She came into the room. He heard her stop a few feet behind him. "His daycare. They're investigating. Thus, tell me exactly what happened." Her voice, when it came, was flat with the flatness of someone who has already told a story too many times and has found a way to tell it without bleeding through it. She'd worked the last 8 months, 60 hours a week, at an architectural consulting firm, entry-level because she'd been out of the field for the pregnancy and the first months. It was honest work and it paid, barely, after rent and formula and childcare costs. The daycare she'd found, Brightwell, near Park Square, had come with recommendations. It had looked right. The staff had seemed attentive. She hadn't known. "You didn't know," he said. "I didn't know." A pause. "I couldn't be in 2 places. I couldn't work and watch him every second." Damien stood up slowly. He turned. Elena looked back at him. There were shadows under her eyes that had been there long enough to look permanent. Her chin was up. He recognized that. The particular angle she held her head when she was refusing to be diminished. He had always found it extraordinary. "I want to see the security footage from that daycare," he said. "The police have it. I want to see it." She held his gaze. "You don't. Trust me. You don't want to see it. Elena." His voice dropped. "I need you to understand something. You called me because you needed help. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But you are going to have to talk to me about this, and we are going to do it my way, because whatever way you were doing it alone left those marks on our son." He said it without cruelty. He said it because it was true, and because they were past the point where managing each other's feelings was the first priority. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not hurt, specifically, but something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The particular complicated thing of hearing a truth from a person you have very legitimate reasons to still be angry with. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay?" "Okay. We'll do it your way." She pulled the blazer off the chair and folded it over her arm. "But tonight we stay here, both of us. He doesn't wake up in this room alone." Damien looked at her. Then he turned and moved the second plastic chair from the corner to the other side of Noah's bed and sat down. "Both of us," he said. He did not sleep. Elena slept for about 2 hours in the chair across from him, her head against the wall, her breathing going deep and exhausted sometime around 2 in the morning. The blazer was over her like a blanket. He watched Noah's monitors. He watched the numbers stabilize and stay. He watched a night shift nurse come in at 2:40, check the IV, note something on a tablet, glance at him with professional blankness, and leave. He sat with his elbows on his knees and thought. The capacity for clear thought under pressure was the thing that had built his empire. Other men panicked. Other men made decisions in the heat of crisis and then spent years paying for them. Damien had learned in his 20s, in rooms considerably less comfortable than this one, with considerably higher stakes, that the first thing crisis did was make you feel like action was the only antidote to pain, and that this feeling was almost always wrong. The right response to crisis was to go very still, to take inventory, to understand the shape of the problem before you started solving it. He took inventory. His son was alive. That was the first and largest fact, the one everything else organized around. The second fact was the bruising. He'd seen what he'd seen, and he'd understood what it meant. And the part of him that had spent 20 years operating in a world where violence was a practical tool was doing something with that information that he was, for now, keeping carefully contained. The third fact was Elena.
He looked at her sleeping across from him. The lines of her face relaxed by exhaustion into something younger, something closer to what she'd looked like when he'd met her, at 30, at a gallery opening in Chelsea where she'd been standing in front of a piece he'd just purchased and telling the artist exactly why two specific compositional choices weren't working. He had stopped 6 feet away and listened to her dismantle the piece with the polite ferocity of someone who loved the thing too much not to be honest about it. He'd introduced himself. She'd known who he was and found it largely irrelevant. He'd spent the next 4 months pursuing her with the single-mindedness that characterized everything he did, and she'd let him catch her because she'd made a decision about him. She'd decided he was worth the risk of someone like him. He'd spent 3 years proving her right. Then he'd spent 6 months proving her catastrophically wrong. He looked at his son. The boy's fever had come down a degree overnight. The numbers said so. The rabbit was still tucked against his side. Damien thought, 15 months. He had been walking around being the infrastructure of the Northeast criminal economy for 15 months while this child grew. While he learned to sit up, to crawl, to say whatever the first word had been. He had no idea what the first word was. He didn't know the arc of any of it. Not the first tooth, not the first time he rolled over, not the first time he looked at Elena and recognized her. He had missed all of it. He had missed all of it because he'd made a decision that felt efficient at the time. But Dr. Priya Anand arrived at 6:15 in the morning with the specific energy of someone who had slept 4 hours and built themselves back to functional on will and caffeine. She was 40, precise, and had the kind of manner that communicated clearly that she would tell you exactly what she thought and expected you to be able to hear it. Mr. Vescari. She shook his hand. Her grip was firm. Elena told me you'd be here. How is he? She pulled the tablet. Walked him through it with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The meningitis diagnosis, the course of antibiotics, the fever reduction overnight, the expected timeline for improvement. Noah's lungs were clear, his responses were good. He was young enough and strong enough that the prognosis, assuming no complications, was favorable. You said assuming, Damien said. There's always an assuming, she said. In his case, the assuming is small. He's fighting this well. His body is responding. Damien looked at Noah, who was still asleep, still clutching the rabbit. The bruising. Dr. Anand's expression shifted by a fraction. I filed a mandatory report with Boston CPS and the police. The pattern is consistent with repeated, non-accidental trauma over an extended period. The injuries are in various stages of healing, some older, some more recent. Someone has been hurting him on an ongoing basis, not as an isolated incident. The words landed in the room like stones. Elena had woken up during the doctor's summary. She was sitting with her arms around herself, looking at a spot on the floor just past Noah's bed, her jaw working faintly. Ongoing basis, Damien repeated. Yes. How long? Based on the healing stages, we estimate a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer. 6 to 8 weeks. Noah had been in this woman's care, in the care of whoever at Brightwell had done this, for 6 to 8 weeks while it happened, incrementally, behind a wall of professional smiles and pick-up time pleasantries, and the practiced innocuousness of an institution that had figured out how to look legitimate from the outside. Damien stood. Excuse me for a moment. He walked out of the room and down the corridor, past the nurse's station, through the double doors, and into the stairwell at the end of the hall. He put his back against the cinder block wall. He breathed. The thing inside his chest was immense. He had hurt people. Not personally, not generally, but he was not a man who'd built what he'd built without making decisions about the application of force. And he had made those decisions, and he had carried them with the kind of equanimity that came from a certain way of looking at the world. He told himself the rules of the world he operated in were different from the rules of the civilian world, and that was true, and the people who got hurt in that world had, in most cases, made choices that put them in it. A 14-month-old boy in a daycare in Boston had not made any choices. He had been left somewhere that felt safe, and someone had decided, over 6 to 8 weeks, in the space between pickups, to hurt him, incrementally. Carefully enough not to leave marks that couldn't be explained, right up until they couldn't be explained anymore. Damien stood in the stairwell and breathed through it. He had one rule in the civilian world, one line he'd held in his entire career. Children were untouchable. He had walked away from a partnership with a trafficking network 10 years ago and had them systematically destroyed inside 18 months because they hadn't understood that rule. He had done it quietly and completely and without a single exception. And yet, his own son. He pushed off the wall. He took out his phone. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Boss, I know, I need you to pull everything on a daycare called Brightwell in Boston, Park Square area. Every employee, every corporate filing, every safety inspection, every complaint that ever got made, and every complaint that got buried. I want it in my hands by noon." A pause. "You want me to go in on this?" "I want information first." Damien's voice was entirely level. This was the thing he'd learned. The voice never showed the inside. "We'll discuss options when I have the full picture." "Understood. You want me there?" "Not yet." He looked back down the corridor through the small wire-meshed window in the stairwell door. He could see the door to Noah's room from here. "I need a few things sent to the hospital, a change of clothes. And call Dr. Samuels at Lenox Hill. I want a second pediatric consult on the boy's case, someone I know." "What's the case?" A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "My son." Silence on the line. Marcus Trell had worked for Damien for 11 years. He was not a man easily surprised. He was surprised now. My son. His name is Noah. He's 14 months old and he's in the ICU at Boston General." Another silence. Then, "I'll have everything to you by 10, but the clothes arrived at 8. He changed in a hospital bathroom and came back to find Elena in the corridor, a paper cup of coffee in each hand, the particular posture of someone who has assembled herself with care in the last 30 minutes and is hoping it holds. She held out one of the cups. He took it. "Thank you." They stood beside each other in the corridor and drank bad hospital coffee in the fluorescent morning and didn't look at each other. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I found out I was pregnant 4 weeks after I moved to Boston. You'd already filed. I would have—" "What?" She looked at him then, not hostile, genuinely asking. "What would you have done, Damien? Paid for everything and kept me at arm's length? Tried to make it into a business arrangement?" She shook her head. "I wasn't going to raise my child in the middle of your world as your ex-wife and your obligation. I wanted to raise him with a real life, a normal life." "That's not your decision to make alone. You made it when you signed those papers in front of all those people." Her voice didn't rise. "I didn't have the luxury of a helicopter and a decision I could walk away from afterward. I had a pregnancy and an entry-level job and an apartment in a city where I didn't know anyone, and I built it myself, and I am proud of that." She paused. "But I needed help that I couldn't give him. That's the truth of it." Damien looked at the wall across from him. "The daycare." "I checked it," she said, and the 3 words carried the particular weight of someone defending themselves against a verdict they've already partially accepted. "I checked their certifications and their reviews, and I talked to 3 parents whose kids went there, and I visited twice before I enrolled him. I did everything right. I just—" Her voice caught. "I missed something. They hid something." "Yes," she exhaled. "They hid something, but he was still there every day, and I was at work every day not knowing." He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. "This isn't on you," he said. "Part of it is." "Elena." "Part of it is," she repeated steadily. "I can hold the part that's mine and still be furious at someone else for the rest. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." He thought, that is exactly the kind of thing she would say. Exactly the precise, load-bearing kind of thing she'd always said. "I want to see him when he wakes up," Damien said. "He's going to be scared of you." She said it simply, not unkindly. "He doesn't know you." "I know." "You're going to have to be very patient." "I know that too." She looked at him, assessing, and then looked away. "Okay," she said, the same word she'd said last night. A small, careful permission. Noah woke up at 9:47. Damien was sitting in the chair on the left side of the bed when it happened. He saw the boy's eyes open, watched them go through the stages, the blankness of someone surfacing from medicated sleep, then the furrowing confusion of a strange room, a strange face, then the immediate and absolute pivot toward Elena, who was standing at the foot of the bed. "Hey, baby," she said softly. "Hey, you're okay. Mama's here." The boy reached for her, and she came around the bed and took his hand, and he held it with the grip strength particular to very small children. Total commitment, no calibration. He looked at Damien over her shoulder. Dark eyes. Damien's eyes precisely. The same shade, the same shape, the particular way they caught light. He had not expected that. He hadn't expected to see himself in there so clearly. Noah looked at him without moving. Not afraid exactly. Wary the way an animal is wary, not aggressive, just reading. "That's someone new," Elena said softly, following Noah's gaze. "He's a friend. Okay? He's a friend of Mama's." Damien said nothing. He held the boy's gaze and waited. The rabbit was still there. Noah found it with his free hand, tucked it against his chest, kept looking at Damien. Then, with the devastating pragmatism of a 14-month-old, Noah apparently decided the stranger was not an immediate threat, because he turned back to his mother and said something that sounded roughly like "wah." Elena said, "Water? Okay, baby, okay." She turned to reach for the sippy cup on the tray. Damien looked at his son, who was sitting there being terribly small and very much alive, and felt something in his chest that he did not have language for, something that was not a feeling he'd ever had access to before, something that had apparently been waiting in him for this specific moment without his knowledge. He was going to burn the daycare to the ground. Not literally. He was going to be smarter than that. He was going to be precise and complete and entirely legal. And he was going to make absolutely certain that every person who had touched his son with malice spent years accounting for it in ways from which there was no recovery. And he was going to do it without a single moment of the theatrical anger he was currently containing, because theatrical anger was wasted anger. But first, he was going to sit in this chair and learn what "wah" meant. Marcus's file arrived at 10:20. Damien read it in the corridor while a hospital social worker was inside with Elena and Noah. 43 pages. Marcus was thorough. He'd gotten personnel files, inspection records, complaint logs, everything that was available through legitimate channels, and a few things that weren't. The name that surfaced at the center of it was Gwen Hartley, 37 years old. Lead caregiver for the infant and toddler room at Brightwell. 2 years employed. Prior to Brightwell, a 14-month gap in employment history that was unexplained in the public record. Prior to that gap, a position at a family care center in Providence that had voluntarily surrendered its license 18 months ago in the wake of a state investigation. The investigation had been settled without criminal charges, with 3 families receiving confidential payments. Damien sat with the file and read this twice. He thought, she did this before. She did this before, somewhere else, and someone paid for silence, and she moved to Boston, and she did it again. He thought, Noah was not the only child. He thought, I need a very specific kind of attorney, and I need them in Boston by this afternoon. He called his general counsel's personal number. While the phone was still ringing, his eye moved down the page to the most recent personnel notation in Gwen Hartley's file, a disciplinary note from 6 weeks ago, filed by the daycare director, which had not resulted in any action. 6 weeks ago. The bruising. The timeline. He stood up from the chair so abruptly that a passing orderly gave him a startled look. He was already dialing. By noon, Damien had 2 attorneys in a Boston conference room, a private investigator who specialized in institutional liability, and a very quiet conversation with a contact at the Boston field office of the FBI, who owed him a favor that was old enough to have developed real value. By 2 in the afternoon, he had a preliminary assessment. Brightwell's corporate structure was connected to a parent company that operated 7 similar facilities across New England. The pattern of behavior, rotating staff with suppressed complaints, institutional silence, financial settlements, suggested Brightwell was not an anomaly, but a system. He relayed this to Elena at 3, sitting across from her at a small table in the hospital family room while Noah slept under monitoring 50 feet away. He laid it out cleanly, without editorializing. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, How many children? We don't know yet. We're trying to establish that. At all 7 facilities. Yes. She looked at the table. Her hand was on the surface between them, very still. What are you going to do? She asked. What I'm going to do, he said, is make sure you have the best possible legal representation, the most comprehensive evidence package possible, and that the federal authorities have everything they need to prosecute this correctly. And Gwen Hartley specifically will not walk away from this. He paused. Elena, I want you to understand something. This is going to be done right, not fast, right. She looked at him. You sound like you're talking yourself out of something. He held her gaze. Maybe I am. She nodded slowly, not approval exactly. Acknowledgement. He woke up again while you were on the phone, she said. He kept looking at the door. Damien was quiet. He was looking for you, Elena said, and something in her voice caught on the words. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. He went back to the room. Noah was awake, the rabbit on his chest, the monitors ticking. He looked at Damien when he came in, that same wary animal assessment, and then, by some internal calculus that Damien would never fully understand, he reached out and closed his small fist around the edge of Damien's sleeve and held on. Damien sat down very carefully and did not move his arm. He sat there until Noah fell asleep again, the small fist still wrapped in the fabric, and the monitors kept their quiet count, and outside the window Boston went on in the rain. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Hartley's apartment. My guy just confirmed she took a day off today, called in sick. Her car is gone. Damien read it twice. He looked at his sleeping son. He typed back one word. Find her. Then he put the phone face down on his knee and sat very still because Noah's hand was still wrapped in his sleeve, and he was not going to disturb that for anything. And the message sat on his phone screen for 11 seconds before Marcus responded. On it. 2 men on her building already. Will update. Damien put the phone back face down on his knee. Noah's fist was still curled in the fabric of his sleeve, the grip loose now in sleep, but not released. The monitors ran their quiet numbers. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart rolled past, wheels squeaking on linoleum, and the sound faded and the room went back to its particular silence. He stayed exactly where he was. He had learned a long time ago that the instinct to move, to act, to put yourself in motion against a problem felt like strength and was frequently its opposite. Hartley was running, or she was hiding, or she was doing something else entirely, and Marcus's men would find her. And in the meantime, the evidence was being compiled and the attorneys were working and the federal contact was making calls. The machine was in motion. What it needed from him right now was not his physical presence, but his restraint. He looked at Noah's face. The fever color had come down another fraction since this morning. The line of his mouth was softer in sleep, the brow unclenched. He looked like a child who had decided provisionally that the immediate world was not threatening and had let that decision carry him under. Damien thought 6 to 8 weeks. He thought, I was in 3 countries during that window. I closed the Meridian deal. I had dinner with 2 senators and a federal judge. I bought a building in Miami at auction and felt nothing in particular about it. His son was being hurt in increments in a room with yellow walls and educational posters, and Damien had been operating his empire with his usual precision. And those 2 things had existed simultaneously in the world, and he had not known, and not knowing did not change the arithmetic of it. Elena came back to the room at 4. She'd been gone 90 minutes, shower, food, a call with her firm that Damien had overheard just enough of to understand she was burning through whatever professional goodwill she'd built in the last 8 months. He'd heard her voice in the corridor, low and controlled, explaining that she didn't know when she'd be back. She came in and stopped just inside the door. She looked at Noah first, the automatic assessment, the monitors, the color in his cheeks, the rise and fall of his chest. Then she looked at Damien. He hadn't moved. You've been sitting in the same position for 2 hours, she said. He's holding my sleeve. She looked at the small fist in the fabric. Something crossed her face that she didn't let become anything. She sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed and put her bag on the floor and pulled her hair back with an elastic from her wrist, The series of motions so automatic they'd clearly been done 10,000 times in the last 14 months. This particular small maintenance of herself in difficult moments. They called from work, she said. I heard. How much did you hear? Enough. She looked at the bed. They're not going to hold the position. I have 3 more days before they need an answer about when I'm coming back. And the answer they need is a date, not a situation. Quit. She looked at him. Quit the job, he said. Noah's medical costs are covered. I've already spoken to the billing department. You won't need the income. That's not how this works. Elena, I am not going to become financially dependent on you. Her voice was quiet and entirely resolved. I did not spend 8 months building something from nothing so that the first crisis that comes along wipes it out, and I'm back to being Damien Viscari's. She stopped. His wife? Damien said. His dependent. She held his gaze. That's what I was going to say. He sat with that. I'm not trying to own you, he said. You're not trying to do anything. You're just doing what you do. You see a problem and you reach for your checkbook because that's the fastest instrument you have. She wasn't accusing. She was stating. Noah's medical bills, yes, thank you. That matters. But my job is mine. Your job is going to fire you. Then I'll find another one. While Noah is in the ICU. Her jaw tightened. While Noah is in the ICU, she repeated, measured. Yes, that's the situation a lot of mothers navigate, Damien. They don't have a helicopter on call. The words landed. He absorbed them. Take the 3 days, he said. We'll figure out the rest after. A silence. She looked at the window. Outside, the rain had stopped sometime in the afternoon, and the late light was coming through gray and thin, the kind of light that made everything look provisional. What did Marcus find? She asked. He told her about Gwen Hartley, the Providence facility, the 18-month gap, the prior investigation. He told her about the 7 facilities connected through the parent company, about the federal contact, about the attorneys in the conference room. She listened with her hands in her lap and her face very still. She did this somewhere else, Elena said when he finished. Yes. And someone paid money to make it go away. Yes. And she kept working with children. Yes. Elena looked at her son. Noah had shifted slightly in sleep, the rabbit now tucked under his chin. She watched him breathe for a moment with an expression that was composed and terrible in its composure. How many children in that Providence case? She said. My attorney is trying to find out. The settlement was confidential. Which means the families couldn't talk. Which means the families were paid not to talk, he said. There's a difference. She nodded. A slow, careful nod. I want to testify, she said. Elena, when this goes to trial, I want to stand up and say what happened to my son. She looked at him. Can you make sure that happens? With all your attorneys and your contacts and your federal friends, can you make sure this doesn't get quietly settled and buried again? That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent. I need to hear you say it directly. He held her gaze. No settlement, full prosecution, public record. She held his gaze for another moment, reading him the way she'd always been able to read him. Not perfectly, she told him once, but accurately enough to make decisions. She had told him that early in the relationship, before she'd known enough to be careful with him, and he'd found it more attractive than anything else about her. The precision of it, the unsentimental accuracy. Okay, she said. Third time she'd said that word in 24 hours. He was beginning to understand it was the closest she was going to come, right now, to trust. At 6:15, Noah woke up crying. Not the weak, disoriented crying of a sick child surfacing from medicated sleep. Something sharper than that. A sound that tightened the air in the room, that brought Elena to her feet and to his side in under 2 seconds, that sent the small alarm on his heart monitor spiking until the nurse came in and confirmed the spike was fear response, not medical deterioration. He'd had a nightmare. Elena held him, talking low, the specific low murmur that had no informational content and all tonal content that existed purely as proof of presence. Noah had both fists in her shirt. His face was pressed against her neck. His shoulders were shaking. Damien stood at the foot of the bed. He had no place in this. He understood that with complete clarity. Elena had 14 months of muscle memory in this exact situation, and he had nothing, no history, no established pattern, and Noah did not know him well enough to want him. And what Damien was experiencing standing at the foot of the bed watching his son shake with fear was something that wanted to collapse the distance between them and understood precisely why it couldn't. He stood there. After 3 or 4 minutes, Noah's shaking settled. His grip on Elena's shirt eased by degrees. She moved him back to the pillow, got the rabbit positioned, pulled the thin blanket up. She was humming something. Not a song exactly, just a sound. A pattern. Noah looked at Damien. He did it from the pillow, turned his head, and found Damien at the foot of the bed with those dark eyes that were so precisely a copy of his own. His face was still wet, and his breathing was still uneven, the aftermath of the nightmare still visible in him. He looked at Damien and didn't look away. Damien stayed where he was. He thought, "What do you do? What is the language here?" He reached into the chair beside him and picked up the stuffed rabbit. Noah had knocked it aside during the nightmare and held it out. Not forcefully, just held it in his open palm, arm extended, an offering rather than a delivery. Noah looked at the rabbit, looked at Damien, reached out with one hand. Damien moved forward slightly so the child could reach it. Noah grabbed the rabbit and tucked it under his chin and closed his eyes. That was it. That was all. But Damien stood thereafter for longer than was strictly necessary, with his arms still slightly extended, and felt something that was going to take him a long time to find words for. Marcus called it 8. Damien took it in the corridor 20 feet from the room where he could see the door. "She's not at the apartment," Marcus said. "Or she wasn't. She came back. My guy watched her go in at 7:42 with a rolling bag. The medium-sized one, not the overnight. She was moving fast. She's packing." That's how it looked. Damien looked at the floor. "When's the next flight out of Logan that makes sense? If she's going tonight, she's looking at the 9:50 to Miami or the 10:15 to Chicago. There's a red-eye to London at 11:40. Pull the manifest on all three." "I can't pull the manifest." "Then talk to someone who can." "Marcus." His voice dropped. "She goes to London. She's gone." A pause. "Damien, if I use that contact and it traces back, it won't trace back. You don't know that. I know that contact has helped us with considerably more exposure than a flight manifest." He waited. "Find out." Marcus breathed through it. "Okay, 20 minutes. 10. He hung up. He stood in the corridor. The thing he needed to keep very straight in his head was the sequence of operations. Hartley running was its own problem, but it was a solvable one, and the method of solving it mattered. His instinct, the one he'd built his career on, the one that had made men come to him because he was clean where others were messy, said the worst thing he could do right now was get physical with this. The federal interest was real and valuable, and it required the kind of cooperation that was incompatible with having someone roughed up or detained outside of legal channels. He needed Hartley found. He needed her located and documented and reported through channels his attorneys had already opened. He needed to not send 2 men to an apartment to make sure she didn't get on a plane. He stood in the corridor and held the phone and ran through this reasoning carefully, the way you run your tongue along a loose tooth, testing it, feeling where it gave. The door to Noah's room opened and Elena stepped out. She looked at his face. "What happened?" she said. "Hartley may be leaving the city tonight." Elena's expression didn't change. She'd gotten very good at that. "Tell me what you're thinking about doing." "I'm thinking about doing this the right way." "And what is the right way?" "My attorneys have already flagged her to the DA's office. If the DA moves fast enough, they can put a hold..." "How fast is fast enough?" "Tonight. If the DA moves tonight." "It's 8 o'clock, Elena said. "What's the DA going to do at 8 o'clock? He looked at her. She looked back. She already knew the answer, which was why she'd asked the question. "There's another way," he said. "I know there is." "If I use that way..." "Then we're in your world," she said. "And once we're in your world, we stay there. The trial, the evidence, the whole thing. It all has to survive whatever you do tonight." He held her gaze. I know that, he said. Do you? Elena. Damien. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice when she was being most serious. I need this to be something my son can know about when he's older. I need to be able to tell him that we did this right, that we didn't become the thing we were trying to punish. A pause. Can you do it that way? He looked at the floor, then at her. Call your attorney, she said. Right now, in front of me. Call them and tell them what's happening and let them handle it through the DA. He pulled up the contact. Made the call. His attorney, Claire Ferris, picked up on the third ring. He told her. She was silent for exactly 4 seconds, then said she was calling the assistant DA directly and she'd have an answer in 30 minutes. He hung up. He looked at Elena. 30 minutes, he said. She nodded. She didn't say anything. They stood in the corridor in the fluorescent light and waited, and the door to Noah's room was closed, and the monitors on the other side of it kept their quiet count. Claire Ferris called back in 22 minutes. They're issuing an emergency travel restriction through ICE. She's flagged at all 3 airports effective immediately. Her passport will get flagged at the gate if she tries to board anything international. A pause. Domestic is trickier. They're working on it. How long? If she tries international tonight, we have her. If she's booked domestic, we're looking at a 6 to 8 hour window before the paperwork catches up. He relayed this to Elena, who was standing 4 feet away and could partially hear it anyway. The DA is taking this seriously, Claire said. The Providence information helped. They're treating this as a pattern case, not an isolated incident. That changes the weight of what they can do quickly. Good. Damien. Claire's voice shifted. The DA's office is going to want to talk to the mother, Elena. Her testimony about the discovery, the timeline, the daycare's response when she raised concerns, it's going to be important. She knows. She wants to testify. A brief silence. Okay. I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. Can she? She'll be there. He looked at Elena, who nodded. We'll both be there. He ended the call. Across from him, Elena let out a breath that had been held for some time. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was something more provisional than that. The particular exhale of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has found a place to set it down temporarily, knowing they'll have to pick it up again. 6 to 8 hours, she said. Yes. So we wait. Yes. She looked at Noah's door. I'm going back in, she said. You should try to sleep. I'm not going to sleep. I know, but you should try. She paused, her hand on the door. She didn't look at him when she said the next thing. What you did tonight. Calling Claire instead of Marcus. That... She stopped, started again. Noah is going to need to know his father made the right call. She went back in. He stayed in the corridor, his phone buzzed. Marcus. Manifest contact says no Hartley on the 950. Chicago 10:15 still processing. London 11:40. She's on it. Damien stared at the message. She was on the London flight. The emergency restriction was in place. The passport would flag. She would be stopped at the gate, or she'd be pulled from the jetway, or worst case, she'd make it to the plane and be met in London by people who had been notified to receive her. It was handled. It was in motion. There was nothing for him to do. He stood in the corridor and understood this with his head and felt the opposite with everything below his neck. The particular physical frustration of a man who has spent his adult life being the mechanism of resolution and is now required to be a bystander to someone else's process. He pressed his back against the wall. Marcus sent a second message. You want me to go to the airport? He typed back, no. Let the restriction do its work. He turned off his phone screen. At 10:43, Claire Ferris called again. He picked up before the first ring finished. She was stopped at the gate, Claire said. Logan Airport, TSA and 2 ICE agents. She's being detained for questioning. Damien closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. The DA's office will process her tonight, Claire continued. Formal charges by morning. She's not going anywhere. A pause. It worked, Damien. Thank you, Claire. Thank Elena, she said. The timeline she gave me about the complaint she filed with Brightwell's director 6 weeks ago, the one they didn't act on, that's what gave the DA enough to move on tonight. That paper trail is going to be everything in this case. He stood with that for a moment. Elena had filed a complaint 6 weeks ago. She had noticed something and filed a complaint, and the daycare had ignored it, and she hadn't known the bruising was already happening by then. And she'd gone back to work because what else could she do? And the complaint was sitting in a file that was now in a DA's folder. She had been trying to protect their son. She had been trying the whole time with every instrument available to a woman working 60 hours a week alone in a city she'd built herself from scratch. And it hadn't been enough. Not because she'd failed, but because she'd been alone. And being alone meant the instruments were limited. And the instruments being limited meant that a woman in Providence, who should have been stopped years ago, had been standing in a room with yellow walls making decisions about what she could get away with. He went back to the room. Elena was in her chair, eyes closed, not fully asleep. Noah was asleep, the rabbit against his chest, monitors steady. Damien sat down in his chair and looked at his son's face in the dim light and stayed there. At some point, much later, Elena spoke without opening her eyes. Did they get her? Yes, he said. Logan. A silence. Good, she said, and that was all. He sat in the dark and thought about the 7 facilities and the other children he didn't know about yet. The ones still going to those places every day, still inside the system that had put those marks on Noah's skin. The attorneys were working on it. The federal machinery was engaging. It was moving. But moving and complete were different things, and he knew from experience that the space between them was where things went wrong, where people got cold feet or lost funding or decided that a complicated prosecution wasn't worth the resources, that a settlement was cleaner, that the families involved could be reasoned with. He needed it to be impossible to settle this quietly. He needed the entire structure of Brightwell and its parent company, Halcyon Child Services, LLC, incorporated in Delaware, offices in 4 states, to be so thoroughly documented and so publicly implicated that no amount of money could make it disappear. That meant something specific. That meant he needed to do something he hadn't done in a very long time and had told himself he was done doing. He needed to use the full weight of what he was. Not the criminal weight, see it? The civilian weight. The weight of a man whose name on a story made it impossible for editors to bury. The weight of a man who could make one call and have 3 investigative journalists on a plane to Boston by morning. The weight of a man who could speak at a press conference, standing next to Elena, and turn a local prosecution into a national story that no DA could walk away from without consequences. He had always avoided that. He had built his empire on invisibility, and he had guarded that invisibility carefully because invisibility was the precondition of everything he did. But Noah's face was in front of him, and there were other children he hadn't seen yet, in other facilities, with other women like Gwen Hartley, who had learned that the system could be leveraged and the parents could be isolated, and the damage could be made invisible if you were patient and careful, and if no one with enough power ever decided to look directly at you. Damien sat in the dark beside his sleeping son and felt the thing he'd been containing for 24 hours reach its limit. He picked up his phone. He called the one journalist in America whose work he'd followed for a decade and whose number he'd never used and whose voicemail he'd always known he could leave a message on if the situation ever demanded it. The call went to voicemail on the 4th ring. He said, "My name is Damien Viscari. I have a story about a company called Halcyon Child Services and what they've been doing to children across New England for at least 4 years. I have documentation, federal involvement, and a family willing to go on record. Call me back at this number, tonight if possible." He hung up. Elena's eyes were open. She was looking at him across the bed. He hadn't lowered his voice enough. Or she hadn't been as asleep as she seemed. "Who was that?" she said. "Mara Voss," he said. "Investigative journalist. National Record." Elena sat up slowly. In the dim room, her expression was something he couldn't quite categorize. Not alarm, not approval, something in the territory between them. "You just went public," she said. "Not yet, but I'm going to." "That changes everything." "Yes," he said. "It does." She looked at him for a long moment, at their son between them, at the monitors, the rabbit, the thin blanket. "Once you do this," she said slowly, "you can't manage it anymore. It becomes its own thing. Journalists, cameras, other families coming forward. You won't be able to control where it goes." "I know." Your name is going to be in every article. I know that too. Damien Vescari, organized crime, protecting his illegitimate son. That's the story they're going to write alongside the one you're trying to tell. He held her gaze. Then that's the story they write. She studied him. He could feel her working through it. The calculation, the risk assessment, the weighing of what this meant against what it cost. She was doing what she'd always done, which was see past the surface of a situation to the structural truth beneath it, and he waited for her to finish. "You'd do that," she said quietly. "Expose yourself like that. For this. For him." He looked at Noah. "And for every other kid in those 7 facilities." Elena was quiet for a long time. Then, very softly, "Mara Voss is good. She won't bury the lead." "No," he said. "She won't." His phone lit up on his knee. Unknown number. Boston area code. He looked at Elena. She looked back. He answered it. "Vescari." A woman's voice, clipped and sharp and already ahead of the conversation. "This is Mara Voss. I just listened to your message. I'm in Boston. I was already here. Tell me everything you know," Mara Voss said, "and don't edit it." Damien looked at Elena once. She gave him the smallest nod. He talked for 40 minutes. He laid it out in order, Brightwell, Hartley, the Providence facility, the suppressed investigation, the settlement, the 7 Halcyon facilities across New England, the federal contact, what Claire Ferris had established in the last 12 hours. He told her about Noah without telling her more than she needed, which was the diagnosis, the bruising timeline, the complaint Elena had filed that the daycare director had ignored. He told her about the parent company's Delaware incorporation and the 4-state footprint and the pattern that suggested this was structural, not incidental. Mara Voss didn't interrupt him once. He could hear her typing. When he finished, she said, "How many children total are we talking about?" "Unknown. We're trying to establish that. Best estimate. Across 7 facilities over a minimum of 4 years, operating at an average enrollment of 30 to 40 children per location. You do the math." A silence on the line. Then, "Where are you right now?" "Boston General, PICU. Your son?" "Yes." "I need the corporate documents, whatever you have on the Delaware entity. My attorney will send them to you within the hour. I need to talk to other families. Any names you have." "I don't have names yet. That's what the federal investigation is building." "How locked in is the federal piece?" "Solid enough that they moved on Hartley tonight. She's in custody at Logan." Another silence. Longer. He could feel her working through it on her end, the same way he'd worked through his decision in the dark of Noah's room, measuring the shape of the thing, assessing the risk architecture of it, figuring out what it was and what it wanted to become. "Vescari," she said finally, "I need you to understand something. If I run this story, I run all of it. I can't give you editorial control over how your name appears. I can't protect your other interests. The story goes where the evidence takes it. I know that. Your name has a specific weight in certain conversations. I know what my name means. Then you know what I'm going to have to include." "Yes." He looked at his son's sleeping face. "Include it." A pause. Then, "My photographer can be at the hospital by 7 a.m. I'd like a photo of the child. Not for the story, not yet. For my own verification. To understand what I'm actually looking at." "No photographs of the child," Damien said. "Flat, non-negotiable." "Understood. Elena Rowan, is she willing to go on record?" He looked at Elena. She was already nodding. "Yes," he said. "All right." Voss's voice shifted. The professional neutrality of it tightened into something sharper, something that sounded like the beginning of anger that had found a productive direction. "I want to meet tomorrow. 8 a.m. Bring everything you have. I'll bring what I've already started pulling on Halcyon." He went still. "You've already been pulling on Halcyon?" "I've been sitting on a tip about this company for 3 months," she said. "I couldn't get anyone to go on record. I couldn't get enough documentation to run it." A beat. "Now I have Damien Vescari, a federal investigation, and a child in the ICU. I can run it." He sat with that. 3 months, he said. Yes. While those facilities were still operating. While I was trying to verify what I had. He didn't say what he was thinking. She heard it anyway. I know, she said quietly. Believe me, I know. A pause. That's why we run it right, and we run it complete, and we make sure it sticks. 8 a.m. She hung up. But Elena hadn't moved. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, watching him. 3 months, she said. She was trying to verify it. While children were... I know. He set the phone down. The story didn't exist without someone willing to put their name on it. Now it does. Elena looked at the window. The darkness outside was beginning to show its first gray edge, the distant suggestion of a morning that was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. She looked exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. The deeper exhaustion of someone who had been fighting on too many fronts for too long. I'm going to be in every newspaper, she said. Yes. My firm is going to see it. Yes. My name, Noah's name. Your name, he said. Noah stays protected. That's in the terms of anything Voss publishes. She looked at him. You already established that. Before I called her. She sat with that for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the partial removal of a specific wariness. Okay, she said, and then smaller. Thank you. He didn't answer. He looked at Noah and listened to the monitors and let the room be quiet. They both slept fitfully in the chairs for a few hours. A night nurse came and went. Noah woke once at 4:30, looked around with fever-bright eyes, found Elena's hand, and went back under. The rabbit stayed tucked against him throughout. By 6, the morning had established itself, gray and cold and clinical through the PICU windows. Damien had changed into the second set of clothes Marcus had sent, drunk 2 cups of hospital coffee that tasted like industrial solvent, and was standing in the corridor reviewing what Claire Ferris had sent through overnight when his phone rang. The number was Claire's. Tell me something good, he said. Her voice was wrong. He heard it in the first half-second, before a single word, the specific quality of a person who has discovered something they weren't looking for and is deciding how to deliver it. I need you to step away from the room, she said. He was already moving down the corridor through the double doors into the stairwell that had become his thinking space. The door swung shut behind him. Talk, he said. The DA's office called me an hour ago. They've been processing Hartley since last night. She's been talking. Good. Damien, Claire paused. The pause was a quarter-second too long. She's not just talking about Brightwell. She's been offering information, trying to trade for a reduced charge. What information? She says she has documentation that the complaint Elena filed 6 weeks ago, the one I told you was going to be central to the case, was forwarded to Halcyon's corporate office the same day Brightwell's director received it. He waited. And she says someone at the corporate level made a decision about how to handle it, Claire said. Not to investigate, not to discipline her, but to actively manage the situation, to move her from the toddler room to the infant room for 2 weeks, enough distance that if anyone followed up on the complaint, she was no longer working directly with the child it referenced, and then move her back. He let that land. That's not a staff management decision, he said. No, Claire said. That's a cover-up decision, at the corporate level. Which means someone at Halcyon's executive structure knew. Knew and acted to protect the facility, yes. Another pause. But that's not why I'm calling you to the stairwell. He felt the back of his neck go cold. Hartley gave them a name, Claire said. Someone she says paid her directly. Not wages, separately. Cash payments made through a shell account quarterly. She says she's had a personal contact at Halcyon since before she started at Brightwell. She says this contact is the reason she was hired despite the Providence flag on her record. This contact is the reason the Providence investigation was settled instead of prosecuted. Who? Damien said. The name she gave them, Claire said, is Marcus Trell. The stairwell was very quiet. He could hear the fluorescent light above him humming. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear, distantly, the sounds of a hospital beginning its morning shift beyond the metal door. "Say that again," he said. "Marcus Trell." She named him specifically. "She has records of the payments. Dates, amounts, an account number that my contact at the DA says traces to a holding entity in the Caymans that we haven't been able to fully map yet, but the routing structure is consistent with—" "Stop." His voice came out very even, controlled in the specific way of something under extreme pressure. "Where's she getting Marcus's name from?" "She claims direct contact. She says he approached her in Providence through an intermediary. She says he facilitated her employment at Brightwell specifically." "Why would Marcus—" "Damien," Claire's voice was careful. "I have to ask you something directly, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Ask." "Did Marcus know about Noah before last night?" He opened his mouth, closed it. He stood in the stairwell and ran backward through 24 hours in his mind. Not frantically, but with the precise systematic cold of a man who had been trained to see patterns in information and was now applying that training to the worst possible data set. The things Marcus had known, the way Marcus had responded when Damien told him about Noah, the word, your, and the half-second of silence before he'd said it. The way Marcus had moved immediately, efficiently, to gather information about Hartley's location. Moved to gather information about Hartley's location. Moved, Damien realized, to know where she was before anyone else could find her. He pressed his hand flat against the cinder block wall. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what Marcus knew." "You need to find out," Claire said, "because if he knew, if he had any prior knowledge of Noah's existence or of the situation at Brightwell, and he concealed that from you, then the question becomes why. And the answer to that question changes the shape of everything." He was already working through it. Marcus had been his operations chief for 11 years. Marcus handled the financial infrastructure, the relationships, the things that needed to be managed quietly and efficiently below Damien's direct involvement. Marcus was the person you called when something needed to be solved at the level of logistics rather than strategy. Marcus was the person who would have known, before anyone else, that Damien Viscari had an ex-wife in Boston who had given birth to his child. It would have been Marcus's job to know that. It was possible, he made himself hold the possibility still and look at it, that Marcus had known about Noah for months, that the intelligence infrastructure Damien had built had surfaced that information, and Marcus had made a decision about whether to bring it to him. And if Marcus had made that decision, if he had looked at what Damien's child represented and decided it was a variable to be managed rather than a person to be told, then the question of what else Marcus had decided to manage opened in front of him like a floor giving way. "Call me back in an hour," he said to Claire. "Damien, you need to be careful how you—" "I know how to be careful." He hung up. He stood in the stairwell for 10 seconds. Then he called Marcus. "Basit." Marcus answered on the first ring. "Morning," Marcus said. Easy, the comfortable ease of 11 years. "Hartley's in custody. I'm watching the overnight on your Boston acquisition." "Where are you right now?" Damien said. A small pause. "Office. Why?" "My New York office." "Yes, why, what?" "Don't leave," Damien said. "I'll be there in 2 hours." "Damien, what's—" He hung up. He went back to the room. Elena was awake, sitting with Noah, who was eating something soft from a small plastic bowl with the focused and slightly baffled concentration of a child, discovering that his body wanted things again. He looked up when Damien came in and then looked back at the bowl. Damien stood in the doorway. "I have to go to New York," he said. Elena looked at him. She read his face. He watched her do it. "What happened?" "Something I need to deal with in person." "Damien, I'll be back tonight." He came into the room and stood at the foot of the bed. Noah had gotten a spoonful to his mouth and was working through it with great seriousness. Damien watched him for a moment. "The meeting with Voss is at 8. Tell her everything. Give her everything Claire has. Don't wait for me." "You're not going to be here." "No." She studied him. He could feel her trying to determine what had shifted and how much to press. She made a decision, not to press, not right now, and he was grateful for it in a way he didn't have time to express. "Okay," she said. 4th time. Different weight to it this time. heavier, with more underneath it. He looked at Noah. The boy had finished most of what was in the bowl and was now regarding the empty spoon with the philosophical disappointment of someone who has used up something good. "Hey," Damien said. Noah looked up. "I'll be back tonight," Damien said, as if the 14-month-old could parse the sentence. Maybe he couldn't, but he looked at Damien with those dark eyes and made a sound that was short and interrogative, something that began with a consonant. "Yeah," Damien said. "Tonight." He left before he could examine too closely why it had been necessary to say that. Bust. The helicopter ate the 90 miles between Boston and Manhattan in 51 minutes. He landed on the building's roof at 8:47. He took the private elevator to the 32nd floor. He moved through the morning activity of his offices. The staff who knew better than to speak to him when he was moving at this pace, who parted without being asked, to the corner suite at the end of the hall where Marcus operated. Marcus was behind his desk when Damien walked in. He looked the same as always. 53, heavy set in the way of men who'd been physically formidable and kept the structure of it past their prime, a face that had the particular blankness of someone who had learned to make it unreadable. He'd been with Damien since the beginning, not the absolute beginning, not the worst years, but the critical years, the years when the operation had either solidified or collapsed, and Marcus had been the man who'd kept it from collapsing. He looked up when Damien came in. He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing. He didn't look surprised, and Marcus Trell was a man who looked surprised when the situation called for it because it was socially useful to look surprised, and he was not performing that now. Damien sat down across from him. He didn't close the door. Closing the door was a statement. He needed this to be a conversation first. "Gwen Hartley gave the DA a name last night," Damien said. Marcus's face was still. "Okay." "She said someone paid her to be at Brightwell. Someone who cleared the Providence flag from her record. Someone who made sure she got hired despite the history." Marcus looked at him. "She named you," Damien said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "That's not accurate," Marcus said. "Tell me what is." "She's facing serious charges. She'll say anything." "Marcus." Damien's voice was quiet. Entirely quiet. The quiet that people who'd worked with him long enough understood was more dangerous than volume. "I'm going to ask you one question. I need you to understand that the answer you give me right now is the only thing that matters in this room. Not the DA, not Hartley, not what can be proven or disproven. Just you and me and the truth. Are we clear?" Marcus looked at him. Something was working behind his eyes, calculation cycling through its options at speed, assessing the landscape, looking for the version of this conversation that came out best. "Clear," he said. "Did you know about Noah?" A beat. One beat too many. "Yes," Marcus said. The room didn't change. The air didn't change. Damien sat in his chair and looked at the man across from him and felt something that was not quite any single emotion, but a compound of all of them compressed into something that had the quality of stone. "How long?" he said. 7 months. 7 months. Noah had been 7 months old. He'd been crawling, maybe. He'd been in the apartment in Boston with the yellow walls Elena had described, in the daycare with the educational posters, growing into a person while Damien had sat in this building and Marcus had known and said nothing. "How did you find out?" Damien said. "Routine background monitoring. We flag anyone who's had significant contact with you or the family. Elena's name was still in the system. When she filed for a birth certificate in Boston," he stopped. "You knew." Damien's voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. "You knew I had a son. For 7 months. And you chose not to tell me." "I was protecting the operation," Marcus said. He said it with the confidence of a man who believes the logic is sound. A child changes everything. A child with your ex-wife, born out of the marriage in Boston, that's exposure. That's leverage. That's a vulnerability that people who want to hurt you would pay serious money to know about. I was managing it. "Managing it," Damien repeated. "Keeping it contained. Keeping Elena and the boy off anyone's radar. Making sure no one with hostile interests found out before you had time to..." "Before I had time to what?" Damien said. "Decide?" You were going to decide when I was ready to know I was a father? I was protecting. Don't. The word landed like a door slamming. Don't say that again. Marcus went silent. Damien stood up. He walked to the window. 32 floors of New York below him, the morning traffic moving in its channels, taxis and delivery trucks, and 10,000 people living their lives with the particular unawareness of people who have not just had the floor removed. Hartley, he said without turning. Tell me about Hartley. A long pause behind him. That's more complicated, Marcus said. I'm sure it is. The Providence situation, I got wind of it when it was being settled. I saw an opportunity to have a contact inside a facility in Boston, someone who owed us, someone who could flag us if Elena or the child came to anyone's attention. Damien turned. Marcus stopped. You put her there, Damien said. You put a woman with a history of hurting children in the facility where my son was enrolled, as a contact. She wasn't. I didn't know she was still doing it. In Providence, it was a single... You didn't know, Damien said, or you didn't look. Marcus's jaw moved. The intent was never to... My son has bruises on his face that are 6 weeks old, Damien said. His jaw, his arm... Someone hurt him on an ongoing basis for 6 to 8 weeks, and that someone was your contact, your placement, your asset. The word came out of him like something torn loose. Asset. Marcus was looking at him with the expression of a man who has run out of versions of the argument that work. I didn't know she was still... It doesn't matter what you knew. Damien's voice was very even, every word placed with precision. You put her there. You made the decision that put her in the same room as my child, and you made that decision without ever telling me the child existed. A silence that lasted a very long time. Marcus, Damien moved back to the desk. He didn't sit. He stood on his side of it and looked at the man across from him. We've been together for 11 years. Yes. I want you to think very carefully about what you say next. Marcus looked back at him. The calculation had stopped. The blankness had come down. Behind it, something that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding, the slow arriving recognition of how far outside the bounds of acceptable this had gone, how completely the logic that had seemed functional from inside it had produced something catastrophic from outside. I was wrong, Marcus said. Flat. Not an apology, just a verdict he'd arrived at. Yes, Damien said. You were. What do you want to do? Damien looked at him for a long moment. You're going to give a full statement to Claire Ferris today. Everything. The Providence arrangement, the payments, the account structure, all of it. You're going to give her every document, every communication, every record related to Halcyon and Hartley and the Providence settlement. Marcus went still. If you do that, Damien said, the DA gets a complete picture of the corporate structure and can prosecute this fully. Every facility, every child. He paused. If you don't, I give them your name directly and they come to you. That's not much of a choice. No, Damien said. It isn't. Marcus looked at the desk. His hands were flat on the surface, large and very still. He had the look of a man taking inventory of what remains when you remove the things you built your identity around. The operation, he said, is no longer your concern, Damien said. You're done, Marcus, today. Whatever I decide to do with what you've given me, you're finished in this building. Marcus nodded, a single, heavy nod. He didn't argue. Whatever he was not a man who argued with things he recognized as true. I'll call Claire, he said. Damien walked to the door. Damien. Marcus's voice stopped him. He didn't turn. For what it's worth, when I found out about the boy, I looked at the intelligence and I thought about it for 2 weeks before I made the call to manage it quietly. 2 weeks. I wasn't certain. But you made the call. Yes. And you lived with it for 7 months. Yes. Damien stood in the doorway. So did my son, he said. He walked out and didn't look back. He was in the helicopter by 10:15, Boston bound, the city falling away below him. The morning sky cold and sharp and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in an office on the 32nd floor. His phone rang. Claire. Marcus called me, she said. He wants to give a statement. Take everything he offers. Damien, the scope of what he's describing, the corporate structure, the payments, this isn't just a child care abuse case anymore. This is RICO territory, federal conspiracy. This goes significantly beyond, take everything, he said, all of it. A pause. There are going to be implications for your operation. If Marcus's financial activity is scrutinized, I know. If investigators start pulling threads, Claire. He looked out the window at the ground below, which was moving and small and organized from this height into something that looked navigable. I know what it means. Do it anyway. Her silence lasted 3 seconds. Okay, she said. I'll take the statement. He hung up. He sat with the sound of the rotors and the cold light and the full weight of what the morning had produced, which was this. The man he'd trusted most in the world had known his son existed and had chosen silence, and in that silence had placed a woman with a history of violence in the room where his child spent every day, and the consequences of that decision were written in old bruises on a 14-month-old boy's jaw and arm and temple. And now fixing it properly, fixing it completely the way it needed to be fixed, was going to require him to open every financial channel Marcus had managed, which meant opening lines of inquiry into his own operation that he had spent 20 years keeping closed. He was going to have to tear down walls he'd built to survive in order to protect something he hadn't known he was capable of protecting. He was going to have to become, in some fundamental way, a different kind of man. The helicopter crossed into Massachusetts airspace. Below, the Boston skyline was beginning to take shape through the cold morning haze, and somewhere inside it, in a room with monitors and a worn stuffed rabbit, his son was waiting for him to come. He came back. That was the first thing Noah registered when Damien walked through the door at 12:43. Not the new lines around his eyes, or the set of his jaw, or the particular way he moved when something inside him had been reorganized, just that he came back when he said he would. Noah was sitting up in the bed, not fully upright, propped against pillows, the rabbit in his lap. He had been doing something with Elena's fingers, some repetitive examination of her knuckles that had been occupying him for the last 20 minutes. When Damien walked in, he looked up and made the short interrogative sound, the same one he'd made that morning. Damien stopped at the foot of the bed. Hey, he said. Noah looked at him, reached out one hand toward him, palm up, the universal gesture that he'd been using with Elena and had not used with Damien until this moment. Damien looked at Elena. She gave him nothing, no instruction, no guidance. This was his. He came around the bed and sat in the chair and held out 2 fingers. Noah grabbed them with his whole fist, examined them with the same forensic interest he'd been applying to Elena's knuckles, then lost interest and went back to the rabbit. But he didn't let go. Damien sat there with his fingers in his son's grip and looked at Elena over the top of the boy's head. Marcus gave Claire a full statement, he said quietly. Her eyes stayed on his. How bad? Bad enough that the federal case doubles in scope. Corporate conspiracy, possibly RICO. He paused. It's going to pull investigation into my financial structure as well. She held very still. How much exposure? Enough that I need to make decisions in the next 48 hours about what I'm willing to disclose voluntarily versus what they find on their own. He looked at Noah. Voluntary is better in every way. You're talking about dismantling things. I'm talking about restructuring things. There's a difference. He paused. Some of it can be restructured. Some of it has to go. She absorbed that. And Marcus? Gone. The word was clean, no anger in it anymore, just the finality of a door that had been closed and locked. I'm sorry, Elena said. He looked at her. 11 years, she said. Not with sympathy for Marcus, something more precise than that. Acknowledgement of the specific cost of a specific kind of betrayal. She understood betrayal in its various forms. She'd lived through one. He thought he was protecting the operation, Damien said. He wasn't wrong that it was a risk. He was wrong about every decision he made after. Noah had started pulling on his fingers with small, rhythmic tugs, testing the resistance. Damien let him. Mara Voss was here at 8, Elena said. We talked for 2 hours. How was she? Thorough. She wanted to know everything. The timeline, the complaint I filed, what Brightwell said when I followed up. A pause. She was kind about it. She didn't make me feel... She stopped. She made it feel like it mattered, not just as a story. It matters to her, he said. 3 months she's been trying to crack this. She's been waiting for someone with enough to go public. She said the story runs Sunday, 3 days. He nodded. That's fast. She said she's been writing it for 3 months. She's just been waiting for the lead. At 2 in the afternoon, Dr. Anand came in with updated labs. The fever was down to 99.1. The bacterial counts were responding to the antibiotics on the projected timeline. She used words like encouraging and on track, with the careful precision of a physician who knew that those words carried enormous weight and refused to deploy them carelessly. She also said Noah could be moved out of the PICU to a standard pediatric room within 24 hours if the current trend held. After she left, Elena sat for a long time without speaking. Then she put her face in her hands, not crying, just pressing her palms against her eyes, with the concentrated effort of someone who has been holding a specific kind of tension and needs to press it down before it escapes. Damien looked at Noah, who was asleep again. He looked at Elena. It's going to be okay, he said. She lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry. Don't. Don't what? Don't say things like that. You don't know. He's responding. She said, I know what she said. Elena's voice was quiet and controlled and had an edge under the control that he recognized. The edge that appeared when she'd been managing something for a long time and needed to manage it a few hours longer and resented being asked to receive comfort instead. I heard every word, but he's still in this room and those bruises are still on his face, and I sat in that chair last night and counted his breaths because I couldn't stop myself. She looked at the bed. So don't tell me it's okay yet. Tell me that when we're somewhere else. He didn't say anything. She was right. He let her be right. What I want to know, she said after a moment, is what happens with the trial. Now that Marcus has given a statement. Now that the federal piece is bigger. It gets better, he said. More defendants, more documentation, harder to settle. And Hartley specifically. She traded information for consideration on her charges. The DA can use her as a witness against Halcyon's corporate structure. In exchange, her charges are reduced but not eliminated. Elena's jaw tightened. Reduced? She's still being prosecuted. She will still be sentenced. The reduction means she avoids the maximum, not that she avoids accountability. How much reduction? I don't have the specific numbers yet. She looked at the window. Her jaw worked once. I wanted maximum, she said. I know. That's what I wanted. I know, Elena. Is there anything? Claire is watching it, he said. We'll push back on anything that doesn't fit the severity of what happened. But we don't control the DA's office. We can influence it. We can't control it. She nodded. The nod of a person accepting a limitation they hate. Sunday, she said. The story runs Sunday. And then what? And then, he said, every other family who's had a child in a Halcyon facility reads it. And they start calling lawyers, and the civil suits start stacking, and the corporate entity becomes impossible to defend. That takes years. Yes. Noah will be in school. Yes, but it will happen. He looked at her. And the criminal case won't take years. The DA has what they need. This goes to a grand jury within the month. She was quiet. Elena. He waited until she looked at him. I know this isn't the speed you want. I know you want it to move faster and hit harder and be more certain. So do I. He paused. But this is the version that sticks. This is the version that doesn't get overturned on appeal in 2 years because we move too fast or cut corners. I need you to hold on to that. She looked at him for a long moment. The assessment again, reading him, taking the measure of what he was saying against what she knew of him, factoring in everything she'd seen in the last 36 hours against everything she'd known in the 3 years before that. "Okay," she said, fifth time. But this one landed differently than all the others, with less of the provisional and more of the real, as if somewhere in the last 2 days the word had developed actual weight behind it. His phone lit up at 3:47. "Claire Ferris. Need you on a call. Now." He stepped into the corridor. "What?" "The DA's office contacted me 20 minutes ago." Claire's voice had the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that changes the shape of an operation in motion. "They've been working the Halcyon corporate structure from Marcus's statement. One of the names that surfaced in the financial documentation, one of the executives tied to the Cayman account, is Richard Cale." Damien went still. Richard Cale was the president of the Boston chapter of the Alderman Group, a lobbying and development firm with political connections running from the State House to 2 congressional offices. He was also, in the invisible architecture of relationships that organized Damien's world, a man who had facilitated 3 significant introductions in the past 4 years. Introductions that had been valuable and that had come with the implicit understanding that they required maintenance. "Cale is on the account," Damien said. "He's not just on the account. Marcus's documentation puts him as a signatory on the corporate structure that owns Halcyon. He's not a passive investor. He's in the governance layer." The calculation was immediate and cold. Cale's presence meant the case had political dimensions that the DA's office had not been anticipating. It meant that somewhere in the chain of protection around Hartley and the other caregivers and the suppressed complaints, there had been a man with the kind of access that could make phone calls disappear and investigations slow down and settlements happen very fast and very quietly. It also meant that Cale, once named in a federal investigation, was going to become a problem for Damien in a specific and structural way. "Does he know Marcus gave the statement?" Damien said. "I don't know. But if he has anyone inside the DA's office, he has people inside everything." Damien pressed his palm against the corridor wall. "How long before his attorneys know?" "Hours, if not already." He thought, Cale would move fast. Cale was a man who had survived 20 years in the overlap between legitimate power and illegitimate money by moving fast when things started to surface. He would assess, he would make calls, he would construct the narrative of his involvement before the narrative was constructed for him. And one of the calls he made would be about Damien. Because one of the things Cale knew, one of the things Cale had known for 4 years, a thing that existed in the category of mutually assured information that held certain relationships in equilibrium, was information about the offshore structure of 3 of Damien's holding companies. Information that, in the context of an expanding federal investigation, became a weapon. "Claire," he said, "I need to know if Cale has already contacted anyone." "I'm working on it." "Work faster." He paused. "And get me a meeting with the lead federal investigator today." "Damien, if you go in voluntarily, I know what it means. Get me the meeting." He hung up and stood in the corridor for 2 seconds, his hand still on the wall, doing the arithmetic of the situation with the particular focused cold that the situation required. Then the stairwell door at the end of the corridor swung open. He registered it peripherally, movement, wrong hour for shift change, wrong pace, and turned. 2 men, suits, the kind of well-cut anonymous suits that suggested money and suggested also that the money had specific purposes. They were moving toward him at the pace of men who are not rushing, but who are also not going to stop. The one on the left was younger, mid-30s, square-jawed. The one on the right was older, 60 or close to it, with white hair and the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and having the room reorganize around him. The older one was Richard Cale. He stopped 6 feet from Damien. They looked at each other. "Damien," Cale said, pleasantly. The pleasantness of a man who has decided in advance how this conversation is going to go. "Richard," Damien's voice was entirely flat. "I heard about your son." Cale's expression arranged itself into something approximating concern. "Terrible situation. I'm glad he's improving." "How did you know he was improving?" A small smile. "I know a number of people here." Hospital board has some friends of mine. Damien looked at him. Walk with me, Cale said. I'm not leaving this floor. Cale glanced at the younger man, who moved 3 feet to the left and stopped, positioning himself in the corridor with the practiced casualness of someone who has done this before. Not threatening, just there. Fine, Cale said. Here is fine. He lowered his voice to a register that the corridor would not carry. I understand Marcus Trell gave a statement this morning. Damien said nothing. I understand that statement included financial documentation that names me in connection with a corporate entity. That's a conversation for your attorney to have with the DA, Damien said. I'd prefer to have it with you first. Cale's pleasantness had developed a very slight edge, like a coin that's been turned over to show the other side. We've had a productive relationship for 4 years. I think we're both interested in that continuing. What are you asking? I'm asking whether the scope of what Marcus provided can be managed. Cale held his gaze. Whether there's a version of this where the relevant documentation is incomplete. Damien looked at him. He looked at Richard Cale, at the 60-year-old white-haired man in the well-cut suit who had just walked into a children's hospital to ask him to corrupt evidence in a case involving the systematic abuse of children, and felt something that was not quite anger because anger was too small for it, and not quite contempt because contempt still required some residual surprise. No, he said. Cale's expression didn't change. Damien, there is no version, Damien said. There is no management. The statement is complete. The documentation goes to the federal investigator this afternoon. All of it. You understand what that means for your own exposure? Yes. The Caledonian accounts. The meridian structure. If investigators start pulling that thread, I know what they'll find. His voice had dropped. I'm meeting with the federal lead this afternoon, voluntarily. I'm going to give them a full account of my financial structure in the context of this investigation. Cale stared at him. You're going to burn yourself down, Cale said. I'm going to build something that doesn't need the dark to function, Damien said. And you're going to spend the next several years trying to explain to a federal jury why your signature is on a corporate document that protected a woman with a documented history of hurting children. The pleasantness was gone. What was left on Cale's face was the stripped-down version, older, harder, the face under the face. Think about what you're doing, Cale said. I've been thinking about it all morning. Damien took 1 step forward, closing the 6 feet to 3. His voice dropped to the absolute floor of audibility. Get off this floor! Get out of this hospital! If you come near this room again, I will personally make sure that the first call the DA's office gets tomorrow morning is a recorded account of this conversation, which I am legally permitted to make in the state of Massachusetts without your knowledge. He held Cale's gaze. Cale looked back at him. The full assessment, the reading of a man trying to determine if what he's hearing is genuine or leverage in a negotiation. He'd had 20 years of practice at that reading. He was good at it. What he found, apparently, resolved the question, because after 4 seconds, he stepped back. Your funeral, he said. Get off my floor, Damien said. Cale turned. The younger man fell in behind him. They moved back toward the stairwell at the same unhurried pace they'd arrived with. The door swung shut. Damien stood in the corridor and breathed. His hands were steady. He checked them, a habit from years in rooms where steadiness was information, and they were steady, which meant the inside of his chest was the only place the last 4 minutes had registered at its full volume. He pulled out his phone and called Claire. Cale just came to the hospital, he said. A sharp intake of breath. He came in person. Asked me to make the documentation incomplete. What did you say? What do you think I said? He turned and looked at the door to Noah's room. Get me that meeting with the federal lead this afternoon. I'll have a time in 30 minutes. And Claire, he watched the door. Whatever they need from me to build this case, financial records, account structures, intermediary relationships, I'm going to give it to them. All of it. A pause. Damien, your attorneys need to be present before you. I know, they will be, but I want you to understand what I'm authorizing. Full cooperation, full disclosure, whatever restructuring that requires on the other end. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Okay, Claire said, careful and professional, and something else underneath both of those.
I'll make the call.
He went back into the room. Noah was awake, sitting with Elena, who was reading something aloud from her phone. A children's story, her voice doing the slight shifts of register that turned different characters into different sounds. Noah was watching her face with the complete absorption of a child who has not yet learned to divide his attention. Damien sat down. Elena glanced at him without stopping, a single, quick read of his face, and then went back to the story. He sat and listened to her voice fill the room and watched Noah's face and let himself have 3 minutes of this without the weight of the rest of it. 3 minutes. Then his phone buzzed. Claire. Federal lead available at 5 p.m. U.S. Attorney's Office, Boston. They're coming to you. Conference room at the hospital admin building. He typed back, confirmed. He looked at the time. 2 hours and 11 minutes. He looked at Noah, who had turned his head and was now examining Damien with that steady, undemanding attention. Not afraid. Not reaching. Just looking. Hey, Damien said. Noah blinked. 2 hours, Damien said, quietly enough that Elena could ignore it if she wanted to. Then I go do something difficult. Then I come back. Noah made the short sound, the interrogative one. Yeah, Damien said. I know. The conference room in the hospital administrative building was on the second floor, away from the clinical wards, a space that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, and had the particular bleakness of a room used for difficult conversations between strangers. The federal lead was a woman named Investigator Dana Marsh, 48, from the FBI's Boston field office, with the particular quality of sustained attention that distinguished field investigators from attorneys. The ability to listen to a large amount of information very quickly and know exactly which pieces mattered. She had 2 junior agents with her. Claire was on Damien's left, an associate attorney on his right. Marsh had a file already. It was thicker than he'd expected. Mr. Vescari, she said, thank you for coming voluntarily. Let's not waste time on pleasantries, he said. Not rudely, just directly. You have a case that has expanded significantly since yesterday. I have information that can accelerate it and close it properly. I have also taken actions this morning that you're going to need to know about. So let's start from the beginning and go through it. Marsh looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded and opened her notebook. He talked for 90 minutes. He started with Noah, the call from Elena, the hospital, the bruising, the diagnosis. Then Hartley, the Providence connection, the halcyon structure. Then Marcus, what Marcus had revealed and what Damien had done with that revelation and why. He told her about Cale's visit to the hospital, naming it, naming the ask, naming his refusal. He told her about the conversation he'd recorded. He told her, with Claire interrupting twice to add legal framing, about the parts of his own financial structure that intersected with the Halcyon corporate network. Not because they were central to the child abuse case, but because they were there and they were going to surface, and he was telling her now so that the surfacing happened in a controlled way rather than a chaotic one. Marsh listened. Her pen moved steadily. Her expression was the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by what people told her in rooms like this a long time ago. When he finished, she looked at her notes. Cale's visit, she said. You have a recording. My attorney will provide it to you today. The conversation you had with him, he explicitly asked you to make the financial documentation incomplete. In those words, substantially, it's on the recording. Marsh made a note. That's an obstruction of justice attempt. She looked up. On his part, not yours. I'm aware. Which means his exposure just expanded considerably. She turned a page. The Caledonian accounts you referenced. I want you to understand that anything you disclose voluntarily in this context will be reviewed in the frame of the current investigation. We're not here to build a separate case against you today. Today, he said. She held his gaze. Today, she repeated evenly. I can't make promises about tomorrow. What I can tell you is that voluntary cooperation is material. It matters to the way this office approaches what comes next. I understand. He straightened in his chair. I'm prepared to fully cooperate with whatever review is necessary. I have conditions, protections for Elena Rowan and the child, that my attorney is going to put in writing. Subject to those conditions, I will give you everything you ask for. Marsh looked at him for a moment. Mr. Vescari, she said, in my experience, people who build what you've built don't usually walk into this office and offer to help pull it apart. He looked at the table, then at her. In my experience, he said, people who build what I've built don't usually have a 14-month-old son in the ICU upstairs. He paused. Things change. Marsh held his gaze. Then she nodded, a small, professional nod that communicated neither sympathy nor its absence, just the acknowledgement of a fact. We'll start with the Halcyon documentation, she said, and we'll go from there. Mates. He was back in Noah's room by 7. Elena had put Noah through what appeared to have been a bath and a small dinner, and some kind of interaction involving a plastic cup that Noah found inexhaustibly interesting. The room smelled faintly of baby shampoo. Noah was in fresh hospital clothes, the rabbit reinstated, drowsy, but awake. Damien walked in and Noah looked at him from the pillow and reached out. Not for his fingers this time. His whole arm extended, the universal toddler signal that required no translation. Damien looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Then she stood up from her chair and moved aside. He sat down on the edge of the bed, very carefully, the way you sit on something fragile. Noah's arm was still extended. He reached out and put his hand against the boy's back. Noah immediately rolled into him, tucking himself against Damien's side with the unselfconscious efficiency of a small animal that has decided a thing is safe. Damien sat very still. His son's head was against his ribs. He could feel the small ribcage rising and falling, the warmth of him, the total and complete surrender of a child who has run out of energy to be guarded. He looked at Elena. She was watching them. The look on her face was complicated and layered and real. Not resolved, not simple, not anywhere near forgiving the thing that still stood between them. But underneath all of that, something that had been very tightly held for a very long time was allowing itself just slightly to be something else. The meeting went well, she said quietly. As well as it could. What happens now? Now, he said, not moving, Noah's small weight against his side. We wait for Sunday, and we see how much noise a story can make. She nodded. Damien. She said his name carefully, the way you handle something you're not sure of yet. Yeah. Thank you. She said it like it cost her something, like it was true and complicated, and she needed him to know both things simultaneously. For today, for all of it. He looked at their son. I'm the one who should have been here from the start. You're here now. He was. Noah's breathing had gone deep and even. He was asleep, the rabbit tucked under his chin, the small fist loosely curled against Damien's shirt. Damien sat with his hand on his son's back and counted his breaths and waited for Sunday, when Maravos was going to open every locked door in this situation and light it up so bright that no one with power over any of it would be able to. Sunday came in cold and clear. The kind of Boston morning that had no ambiguity to it. Hard blue sky, air that cut, sunlight that was bright and offered no warmth. Damien stood at the window of the private room Noah had been moved to the previous afternoon. A real room with a real window and only one monitor now instead of 6, and drank coffee that was still bad but marginally better than the PICU version, and watched the city begin itself outside. Noah was asleep behind him, had been asleep since 9 the previous night, a long, uninterrupted sleep that Dr. Anand had said was the best possible sign, his body using the reduced medical intervention to do the work it had been too compromised to do before. His temperature had been normal for 18 hours. The bruising on his jaw had faded another degree toward yellow. He'd eaten most of his dinner. At 6:47, Damien's phone lit up. A link. From Mara Voss. No text, just the link. He opened it. The headline read, Halcyon Child Services, How a 7-Facility Network Protected Abusers and Silenced Families for 4 Years. Below it, the subhead, Federal Investigation Underway. Multiple arrests expected. One father decided the cost of silence was too high. He read it standing at the window with the cold light coming in. It was long. 6,000 words, with documents embedded, with photographs of the facilities, with a timeline that laid out the Providence settlement and the corporate structure and the Cayman account and the names attached to it, including Richard Cale, including the shell entities, including the routing that connected the money to the protection. Mara Voss had done what she said she'd do. She hadn't buried anything. She hadn't softened anything. She had written it the way things needed to be written when the purpose was not to be read comfortably, but to be impossible to ignore. Elena was named. Her quote was near the top of the piece, pulled out in a larger font. I filed a complaint. They moved her to a different room for 2 weeks and then moved her back. My son has bruises that are older than 6 weeks. You do the math. Damien was named. The piece did not shy from what he was. It contextualized him with the precision of someone who had done serious research and was not going to pretend the story was cleaner than it was. Damien Viscari, whose financial interests have long operated in the shadow of legitimate business, made an unusual decision last week to go on record, to cooperate fully with federal investigators, and to be named publicly in connection with a story that could expose significant aspects of his own empire. He did it, he says, because his 14-month-old son is in a hospital bed. He read that sentence twice. He put the phone down. Behind him, Noah made a sound. The short, soft sound of someone very small beginning to surface from sleep, not yet distressed, just arriving. Damien turned and went to the bed and sat in the chair and waited. Noah's eyes opened, found him, stayed. Morning, Damien said. Noah blinked, reached for the rabbit, found it, made the interrogative sound. Yeah, Damien said. I'm here. About. Elena read the story at 7:15, sitting in the chair on the other side of Noah's bed, with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it the way she read everything, completely, without skimming, her eyes moving at a steady pace through the full length of it. Damien watched her do it and watched her face, which was doing very little on the surface and a great deal underneath. When she finished, she set the phone down and looked at the window. She didn't pull any punches, Elena said. No. About you? No. She was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? He considered the question. Like I asked for it, and like it was the right call. She looked at him. You knew exactly what she was going to write. I knew the shape of it, and you went ahead. Yes. She looked at Noah, who was engaged in the serious business of trying to fit the rabbit's ear into his mouth, an endeavor the rabbit was passively accepting. My firm is going to see this, she said. Yes. My name is the second paragraph. Yes, she exhaled. I'm going to have to make some calls today. I know, if there's anything I can do, There isn't, she said it without heat. That part is mine. She picked up her coffee, looked at it, set it back down. But Damien, she paused. The way she said his name when something important was attached to it, the slight weight she put on the first syllable. What you did, with the federal meeting, with Cale, all of it. She looked at him directly, which she'd been doing more of in the last 48 hours, the carefully managed eye contact becoming something more sustained. I want you to know I see it. He held her gaze. I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not saying it fixes anything between us. I'm not saying that. I know. But I see it. What it cost you. He looked at Noah. It didn't cost me anything I wanted to keep. She was quiet. Then, that's the first thing you've said in 4 days that sounds like the man I married. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer that was sufficient. By 10 in the morning, the story had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, it was on the front page of 4 national news sites. By 2 in the afternoon, the Boston DA's office had issued a press release confirming the federal investigation, the arrests of Gwen Hartley and 2 Halcyon corporate officers, and the impending grand jury proceedings against Richard Cale. Cale's attorney issued a statement calling the allegations without merit. It was the kind of statement that got issued when the evidence was so comprehensive that a denial was the only remaining option, which meant it was functionally worthless. Damien's phone rang without stopping. He let most of it go to voicemail. Claire Ferris called 4 times with updates, each one adding another piece to a structure that was assembling itself faster than he'd anticipated. Civil attorneys contacting Mara Voss about other families, a state investigation opening into Halcyon's licensing across 4 states, 2 members of Congress requesting briefings from the FBI's field office. The machine was in motion, and it had found its own momentum, and it didn't need him to push it anymore. He sat in a chair beside his son's bed and let it move. The call he'd been waiting for came at 3:17, not from Claire, not from Marsh, from a number he didn't recognize with a Providence area code. He answered. A woman's voice. Young or youngish, mid-30s maybe. Careful. Is this Damien Vescari? Yes. My name is Laura Stett. I had a daughter at Brightwell 18 months ago. She's 3 now. A pause. He could hear something in the background, a child's voice, indistinct. I read the article. She stopped. When she started again, her voice had changed texture. I filed a complaint too, about the same woman, Hartley, 14 months ago. He said nothing. He let her say it. They told me there was no evidence of what I was describing, Laura Stett said. They told me my daughter bruised easily. They said children at that age sometimes developed what they called adjustment behaviors in daycare settings. A pause. I was 28, and I didn't know what that meant, and they said it like it was a diagnosis, and I believed them. Her voice went flat with the flatness of retrospective horror. I pulled her from the program, but I didn't push further. I didn't know I could. Ms. Stett, Damien said, I'd like to connect you with my attorney today. Her name is Claire Ferris. You should have independent representation, but Claire can help you understand your options. Your article said there were other families. We believe so, yes. How many? We don't know yet. That's what the investigation is establishing. A silence. In the background, the child's voice again. A question. Something about a toy. He heard the woman answer it with the automatic ease of someone whose attention splits without effort. Then she came back. My daughter doesn't remember it, Laura Stett said. She's 3. She doesn't remember any of it. A pause. Sometimes I think that's good, and sometimes I think it still happened. Whether she remembers or not, it still happened. Yes, he said. It did. Is your son going to be okay? He looked at Noah, who had fallen asleep again with the rabbit on his chest, the afternoon light falling across the bed in the particular way of hospital rooms that face west. He's going to be okay, he said. And this time it wasn't a thing someone had told him. It was something he knew in the way you know things that have been tested and held. The grand jury convened 4 weeks later. In that time, Noah came home, not to Boston and not to New York, but to a house in Newton that Damien had leased 2 days after the story ran, a house with a yard and a room that had been painted a color Elena chose, a pale, warm yellow that was nothing like the daycare yellow, that was deliberate and chosen and entirely different. She had chosen it herself, and he had not commented on the choice, only noted it. He had taken up residence in a suite at a hotel 8 minutes away. Not in the house. He understood the difference between presence and intrusion, and he was committed in this period to learning the former without slipping into the latter. He came every morning. He left every evening. He had dinner with them 3 nights a week. Noah, who had added 4 words to his vocabulary in the 4 weeks since the hospital, had one of those words be something that sounded imprecisely, but unmistakably, like an attempt at da. He deployed it inconsistently, and Elena had not commented on it, and Damien had not commented on it, and it sat between them like a small, fragile, significant thing that neither of them wanted to handle carelessly. He restructured the operation. It took the 4 weeks between the story and the grand jury proceeding, and it was brutal work. Not emotionally brutal, but logistically, the kind of brutal that came from 20 years of architecture having to be rebuilt while still functional, boards changed, entities dissolved, relationships renegotiated or severed. He lost 3 significant partnerships. He lost 2 people who had been with him for over a decade and who made clear, without drama, that the new arrangement wasn't what they'd signed up for. He kept the real estate portfolio. He kept the construction arm. He kept the technology investments, which had been clean for years and required no restructuring at all. He kept the relationships that were worth keeping and let the others go with the understanding that some of what he'd built had always required darkness to survive, and he was no longer interested in the darkness, and so those things would have to go. It did not feel like sacrifice. That surprised him. It felt like removing weight he hadn't known he was carrying. The day Gwen Hartley testified before the grand jury, Damien sat with Noah in the yard of the Newton house while Elena was inside on a call with her new employer, an architectural firm in Cambridge that had called her 2 days after the story ran, that had read what she'd done and what she'd survived, and had offered her a position with a flexibility arrangement she hadn't known to ask for. The yard had a maple tree at the far end, bare now in the late November cold, its branches making precise patterns against the pale sky. Noah was on the grass in a padded jacket, doing the thing he'd been doing for the past week, which was walking. Not steadily, not without casualties, but walking. The upright, lurching progress of someone who had recently discovered this capability and was committed to its full application. He walked toward the maple tree. He fell. He sat there on the cold grass for a moment, assessing the situation, and then he got up. Not crying, not looking for reassurance. Just got up and recalibrated and walked again. Damien watched this from the back step. He thought, 7 months ago, Marcus knew this child existed and decided it was a variable to manage. 6 weeks before the hospital, Elena filed a complaint, and a woman moved a child to a different room for 2 weeks and then moved her back. 3 months before the hospital, Marvos had a tip she couldn't run because no one would go on record. 15 months before any of this, he had signed papers in a hotel and told himself it was efficiency. He thought, all of it had to happen in exactly the way it happened for this particular morning to exist, and he would not have chosen any of it, and he could not be grateful for the machinery of it, but he could be, was, completely and without reservation, committed to what stood on the other side of it, which was a boy in a padded jacket walking toward a maple tree in a November yard, falling and getting up. Elena came out of the house at 11:15, her phone in her hand, her hair loose, a jacket pulled over the shirt she'd been working in. She stopped on the step beside him. They both watched Noah attempt the maple tree again. "How did the call go?" he said. "Good. They want me for the Harwick Commission project. Starts in January." "That's a significant project." "Yes." A pause. "I know." He could hear the thing underneath those 2 words. The specific weight of a woman who had built herself back up from a place she hadn't expected to be in, who was now standing on something real and who was not taking it for granted, and who did not need him to congratulate her on it. "The grand jury is in session today," he said. "I know." Claire says Hartley's testimony is cooperative. She's naming names, giving detail. The DA is satisfied with what they have. When is the trial? Spring, March, maybe April. He looked at Noah, who had reached the maple tree and was standing with both hands on the bark, looking up into the bare branches. "You'll testify." "Yes." "You've been preparing." "Every week." She was quiet. "I'm not scared of it. I was, in the beginning. Now I just want it to happen. I want to be in that room and say it out loud in front of people who have to write it down." He understood that. He understood it as the particular need of someone who has carried something alone for a long time and needs the weight of it acknowledged by more than just the people who already know. "You'll be ready," he said. "I know I will." She said it without arrogance, just as a fact about herself that she'd established and was done questioning. Noah had sat down under the maple tree. He was looking at the ground, picking at something. A leaf, a twig, some piece of the yard's inventory that required investigation. His jacket was the color of a school bus. Against the pale gray of the November grass, he was the most visible thing in the world. "Damien," Elena said. "Yeah." She was looking at Noah, not at him. "I don't know what this is. Between us. I want to be honest about that. I don't know what I want it to be yet, and I don't think you should assume, and I need you to not push." I'm not pushing. You're not. You've been. She paused. You've been patient, in a way I didn't expect. She turned and looked at him then, directly, and the morning light was on her face and she looked tired in the deep-down way that didn't go away quickly, but she also looked like herself, which was the specific version of herself that had always been capable of more than any situation had yet required. I'm saying I see that, and I'm saying it counts. He held her gaze. I know we're not where you want to be, he said. I know you know that. I'm not in a hurry. You are, she said, with the directness that had always been one of the things he'd loved most about her. You're in a hurry. You're just choosing not to be. That's different, and I appreciate the difference, and I need it to continue. It'll continue, he said. She looked back at Noah. He said something this morning that I think was meant to be my name, she said. He's been doing this thing where he tries sounds out and looks at you to see if you respond, like he's testing vocabulary in real time. He said, Elena? He said something that started with an E and ended in a sound that might have been an A, and he was looking directly at me. She almost smiled. I'll take it. Damien looked at his son under the maple tree. He said something this week that I think was meant to be da. Elena was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I heard him. He looked at her. She looked at the tree. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. It's... She exhaled. It's a lot. When I heard it, it was a lot. Yeah, because it's what I wanted for him. From before he was born, it's what I wanted, and it didn't happen the way it was supposed to happen, and now it's happening a different way. And I don't entirely know how to feel about that yet. You don't have to know yet. I know I don't. She looked at him. I'm just telling you what's true. I know. He paused. That's all I want from you. What's true? She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself to look, and something in the look was not resolved and not finished and not ready to be named, but it was real, and it was there, and they both knew it. Then Noah fell down again. Both of them moved instinctively. A half step forward, the automatic parental flinch. Noah sat up, looked at the grass, made a sound of mild philosophical complaint about the ground's continued treachery, and began the process of standing. Elena put her hand over her mouth. Not distress. She was laughing, quietly, surprised into it, the kind of laugh that escapes before you've decided to have it. Damien felt something loosen in his chest at the sound of it, something that had been tight since the night of the phone call, and maybe longer than that, maybe since a hotel conference room 15 months ago when he'd told himself the efficient thing and the kind thing were the same. They weren't the same. He knew that now. The trial of Gwen Hartley and 3 Halcyon corporate officers, including the company's regional director and its chief compliance officer, opened in the second week of March. Richard Cale was tried separately, 3 weeks later, on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and financial fraud. His attorney got a continuance, and then another continuance, and then the evidence was so comprehensive that the continuances stopped working, and the trial happened and took 8 days, and the jury was out for 2. Damien sat in the courtroom for every day of Hartley's trial. He sat in the gallery in a dark suit and said nothing and watched. Elena testified on the 3rd day. She was on the stand for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She told the court about Noah's first week at Brightwell. She told them about the complaint she'd filed, the conversation with the director, the answer she'd been given. She told them about the day she'd noticed the bruise on his jaw. Standing in the pickup line, looking at her son in the afternoon light, seeing something that had not been there the morning before. She told them about driving directly to urgent care. She told them about the urgent care doctor's face when he'd examined Noah. She told them about the call to Damien. She did not cry. Not once. She had said she would not, and she did not, and the not crying was more devastating than crying would have been, because it was the controlled, terrible clarity of a woman who had decided that this room was not a place for grief, but for record, and that the record was going to be complete. The defense attorney cross-examined her for 35 minutes. He tried 3 different angles, like the reliability of her timeline, the nature of her complaint, the possibility of alternative explanations for the bruising. She answered each one with the precise, factual patience of a woman who had prepared for exactly this and was not going to be moved from the ground of what she knew. When she stepped down, she walked back to her seat without looking at Hartley. Damien was sitting in the row behind her. She sat down and straightened her jacket and put her hands in her lap. He leaned forward, slightly, so his presence was behind her left shoulder, close enough that she could feel it without requiring any visible acknowledgement. She sat a little straighter. He sat back. Well, the verdict in the Hartley case came on a Tuesday. The courtroom had the particular compressed tension of a space where everyone is doing the same thing, waiting for a word. Damien was in the third row. Elena was 2 rows ahead of him, beside Claire Ferris. The defense table was across the room. Hartley sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the table surface. The foreperson stood. Guilty on 4 counts of child abuse. Guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct. Not guilty on 1 count that the prosecution had always known was thin. The not guilty was a small wound. The rest was everything. Hartley didn't react visibly. Damien watched her and thought, she's been managing appearances for so long it runs all the way through her. Even now. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks out. In the gallery, a woman 3 rows back put her face in her hands and started crying, and the man beside her, her husband, Damien assumed, put his arm around her, and he knew without being told that they were parents of one of the other children, one of the families who had read the story in November and called Claire and added their name to the record that had become too large to be settled or buried. Elena turned in her seat and looked at him. He looked back. She nodded. Just once. The nod of a woman who had said what she came to say in a room that was required to hear it and who was now doing the slow private work of putting something down. He nodded back. In the hallway outside the courtroom, surrounded by the ambient noise of a courthouse at mid-morning, Elena stopped walking and turned. He stopped. They were in a corridor with marble floors and high ceilings and the sound of 100 other people's business moving around them. She looked at him with the look she'd been developing over the last 4 months, the one that had the history of everything in it, but was not imprisoned by that history. Kara Stanton, she said. He held very still. I need to ask you about her. Once. I need you to answer me once, and then I need it to be done. Can you do that? Yes, he said. Did you love her? He looked at Elena. He looked at the woman who had stood in a courtroom for 2 hours and 40 minutes and told the truth without flinching, who had built a life from a city she'd arrived in alone and pregnant, who had called him on a storm-soaked Friday night because she had no other option, and then, having called him, had rebuilt her options one by one so that he would never again be the only one. No, he said. I didn't love her. I wanted something I couldn't name, and I reached for the wrong thing to find it. He paused. That's the truth. Elena looked at him for a long time. I know, she said finally. I think I knew at the time. I think that almost made it worse. I know. The thing I couldn't forgive wasn't the affair. She said it like something she'd worked out in the dark and was saying for the first time in daylight. It was that you made me feel like I wasn't enough to want, and that made me feel like I'd been wrong about myself. A pause. I wasn't wrong about myself. No, he said. You were never wrong about yourself. She held his gaze. I'm not ready to go back, she said, to what we were. I know. I might never be ready for that exact thing. I know that too. But I am... She stopped, looked at the floor, then back at him. The look of a woman who is about to say something that costs something and has decided it's worth the cost. I'm not closed to what it could become. If it's different from what it was, if we're both different. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than the thing she'd just offered, which was not a promise and not a declaration, but was real and was hers and was given freely. She put her hand on his arm, the briefest contact, 2 seconds, 3. And then she walked ahead of him toward the courthouse doors. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he followed her out into the March light, which was cold and direct, and fell on the courthouse steps and the street below,
and the city beyond that in the unsentimental, clear-eyed way of a morning that was not asking anyone to feel anything in particular, but was simply, insistently there.
6 weeks later, on the day of sentencing, Noah Vescari Rowan turned 16 months old. He celebrated this milestone by refusing to eat his breakfast, discovering that the dog of a neighbor 2 houses down was available for viewing through the fence, and falling asleep in his jacket on the car ride to the park, with such completeness that he did not wake up when carried inside and deposited on the small mattress Elena had set up in the second bedroom. Damien had been at the sentencing that morning. He had sat in the same third row and watched the judge deliver a sentence of 11 years on the primary counts, with no possibility of early release for the first 7. He had sat and listened to the sentence and felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple, but was something in the direction of completion. The particular sensation of a thing that has been moving for a long time arriving at a stop. He had texted Elena one word from the courtroom. 11. She had texted back, okay, and then a minute later, come for dinner tonight. He arrived at the Newton house at 6. Noah was awake from his nap, recently fed, in a state of high-energy investigation of the kitchen, moving from cabinet to cabinet with the focused intensity of someone conducting an inspection. He saw Damien in the doorway and made the sound, the D-adjacent sound, and lifted his arms. Damien picked him up. Noah grabbed a fistful of his collar and examined it with great seriousness, and then leaned his head against Damien's shoulder with the total, unqualified weight of a child who has decided something and is done deciding it. Elena was at the stove. She looked at them over her shoulder. He's been doing that all day, she said, the grabbing the collar thing. Everything gets grabbed. He's cataloging. He is. She turned back to the stove. Dinner's 15 minutes. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his son against his shoulder and watched Elena cook, and let the 15 minutes be exactly what they were. Not a resolution and not a destination, not the end of something or the clean beginning of something else, but a thing that was happening, specifically and irreversibly, in this kitchen, in this light, at this hour. Noah lifted his head and looked at Damien with the dark eyes that were precisely his own. Then he put his head back down. Damien's hand was on the small of his son's back, feeling him breathe. Outside, the March evening was coming in through the kitchen window, the particular blue-gray of late winter light that carried in it the suggestion of something else coming, something that was not yet here, but was close. He stood in the doorway and held his son, and didn't reach for more than that. It was enough. It was, he understood now, standing in a kitchen in Newton, Massachusetts, with 11 years of his former life dismantled behind him, and whatever came next still in the process of becoming itself. It was the most he had ever had. The empire he'd built across 20 years had never once felt like this. He had spent 2 decades building walls and calling it architecture. He had structured every relationship around its utility and called it discipline. He had let the one woman who'd seen through all of it walk out of a hotel conference room and told himself it was clean. None of it had ever felt like this. Like a boy breathing against your shoulder. Like the smell of something cooking. Like a woman who had every reason to have written you out of her life and had chosen, with the same precision she applied to everything, not to. Damien, Elena said. Yeah. Set the table. He looked at her back. The ordinary authority of it. The complete and unremarkable domesticity of a request that assumed his presence as a given. Yeah, he said. Okay. He shifted Noah to his left arm, reached for the cabinet with his right, and set the table. The story ran at 6:47 on a Sunday morning, and by noon it had become something larger than a story. Damien knew this because Claire Ferris called him at 12:03 with the particular controlled urgency of someone managing a situation that had exceeded its projected boundaries, and because Mara Voss sent him a text that read simply, "It's moving. Hold on." And because his phone, the private one, had received 11 calls before 10 a.m. from numbers he didn't recognize, which meant the number had surfaced somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, which meant the infrastructure of his privacy was already beginning to shift under the pressure of what Sunday morning had become. He sat in Noah's room at the Newton house. They had been home for 9 days now, The room with the pale yellow walls and the curtains Elena had chosen, and the small bookshelf already accumulating the particular chaos of a toddler's library. And read every word of Maravos's piece on his phone while Noah slept in the crib 6 feet away, and the house was quiet around them. It was a complete piece. It was the kind of piece that got written once every few years by someone who had been waiting the right amount of time for the right amount of evidence. And when it finally came together, it came together all at once, fully formed, with nowhere for the subject of it to hide. Maravos had written Halcyon Child Services into a corner from which there was no dignified exit. She had written the Providence settlement, the shell accounts, the Delaware incorporation, the 7 facilities, the pattern of staff rotation, the suppressed complaints, the quiet movement of a woman with a documented history from room to room within a building, while a child's mother waited for a return call that never came. She had written Elena's quote near the top, and it sat there in the larger font like a verdict the piece then spent 6,000 words proving. She had written Damien with the accuracy she'd promised, not kindly, not unkindly, but accurately, which was the only version he'd asked for. The piece noted his cooperation with federal investigators and the voluntary financial disclosure and the decision to go on record, and it noted the nature of his business interests without editorializing, and it let the reader draw the conclusion that a man who had operated in deliberate shadow for 20 years had stepped into light for the first time, and that the reason was a 14-month-old boy in a hospital bed. He put the phone face down on his knee when he finished. Noah stirred. Not awake, just the deep body shifting of a child doing the serious work of sleep. The rabbit was tucked against him. His face was smooth and warm in the morning light coming through the curtain gap. The bruising on his jaw now fully faded, gone completely, the skin beneath unmarked in his. Damien looked at his son's face and sat with the full weight of the morning. Elena came downstairs at 7:30 with the look of someone who had been awake since before the story ran and had been waiting for him to finish reading it. She was in jeans and a gray sweater, her hair loose, her feet bare on the kitchen tile. She poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to him in the doorway of Noah's room without speaking. He took it. They stood together in the doorway and looked at the sleeping boy. 42,000 shares as of 20 minutes ago, she said quietly. Claire texted me. It'll be more by afternoon. I know. She wrapped both hands around her cup. My phone has been going since 8. People I know, people I haven't talked to in years. She paused. 3 women from my building in Boston. Mothers I'd seen at pickup. He looked at her. They had complaints too, she said. Different children, different rooms. None of them pushed it the way I did, and they've been carrying that since. Her voice was steady, but he heard the thing underneath it. The specific, complicated grief of learning that your experience was not an anomaly, that the thing you survived was happening to other people in adjacent rooms while you were surviving it. They're calling attorneys. Good. One of them said she felt like she'd been waiting for permission to be angry. Elena looked at the crib. That's the thing about stories like this. Everyone is already angry. They just need someone to go first. You went first. She shook her head slightly. You went first. I just agreed to be named. You filed the complaint 14 months ago. Alone. With no one backing you up. He held her gaze. You went first. I just finally caught up. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Noah and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. Bermots. By 2 in the afternoon, the calls Damien had been anticipating started arriving through proper channels. The first was from the Boston DA's office, not the assistant he'd been dealing with, but the DA herself, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had not been publicly connected to the case until this morning, and who was now, apparently, very publicly connected to the case whether she'd planned to be or not. She wanted a meeting Monday morning. She wanted Claire Ferris present. She wanted, based on the tone of the call, to discuss the scope of the federal cooperation in terms that suggested she was no longer thinking about this as a regional prosecution. The second call was from Investigator Marsh at the FBI field office. Marsh was characteristically direct. The story had surfaced 5 additional families across 3 states who had contacted the field office directly after reading it. 2 of those families had documentation, complaint records, photographs, medical reports, that extended the evidentiary timeline significantly. The grand jury timeline was being accelerated. She needed Damien's financial documentation formally submitted through counsel by Wednesday. Wednesday, he said. Wednesday, Marsh said. The scope of this moved this morning. We're moving with it. He said he'd have it to her. He hung up. He sat in the kitchen of the Newton house with the afternoon light falling across the table and understood that the machine had found its own gravity and was pulling things toward it that he would not be able to redirect or moderate. This was what he'd set in motion when he'd called Mara Voss from Noah's hospital room on a Wednesday night with his son asleep against his side. He had known it then, and he'd done it anyway, and now it was doing what he'd designed it to do, which was be unstoppable. The cost of unstoppable, he was discovering, was that it moved through your own territory as readily as through your enemies. Claire Ferris arrived at the Newton house at 4. She came alone, without the associate, which told him before she said anything that the conversation was going to be the kind that required fewer people in the room. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with a folder she didn't open and her hands flat on the surface. The voluntary disclosure is going to protect you substantially, she said. I want to start with that, because what I'm about to tell you is difficult, and I want you to have the context. Tell me. The financial review that the federal investigators have now formally opened, and it is formal as of this morning, it moved from investigative inquiry to formal review based on what Marcus's statement provided, is going to require a complete audit of the Meridian structure and the 3 Caledonian accounts. That's an 18-month process, minimum. I know. During that 18 months, those assets are effectively frozen pending review. You'll have operational funds through the legitimate portfolio, but the Caledonian liquidity is gone for the duration. How much of my operational capacity does that affect? Claire looked at the folder. Approximately 60% of your current liquid position. He sat with that number. 60% of liquid position for 18 months meant a fundamental restructuring of how the legitimate portfolio was financed, which meant decisions about which elements of the construction arm and the real estate portfolio could sustain themselves on their own cash flow and which required the Caledonian liquidity to function. Some would need to be sold. Some would need partners he didn't currently have. Some would simply not survive the 18 months as currently constituted. What's the exposure on the Caledonian accounts themselves, he said. If they find what I think they'll find, if they find structured deposits that can be traced to activities that predate the cooperation, Claire said carefully, the question becomes how much of that predates the cutoff date we've established with the federal team and how much falls within the cooperation window. The cooperation window protects you on anything within it. Outside the window, she paused. It depends on what's there. There are things outside the window, he said. I assumed there were. How bad is bad? At worst, we're talking civil forfeiture on a portion of the Caledonian assets, possibly a fine structure. I don't think we're talking criminal exposure on your direct person, given the cooperation and the circumstances and the nature of what you've built. But I want to be honest with you that I cannot guarantee that until I see what the auditors find. He looked at the table. He'd built the Caledonian structure over 16 years. It had been the financial spine of everything, the invisible circulatory system that moved money through legitimate territory from origins that required the darkness to exist. He had known, building it, exactly what it was. He had never deceived himself about what it was. He had simply made a decision that the darkness was the cost of what it enabled, and that the cost was acceptable. He looked at it now from the other side of that decision. Civil forfeiture, he said. Worst case, on what portion? Up to 40% of the Caledonian position. He did the math. He put the number in his head and held it there, next to the number of what would remain, and assessed whether what remained was enough. It was enough. It was enough to restructure around, to build something different from, to give Noah a life that didn't require Damien to be the thing he'd been in order to maintain it. It was enough. Not what he'd had, not what he'd built, not the empire in its 20-year form, but enough. Okay, he said. Claire looked at him. Okay. Whatever they find, we cooperate. Whatever the forfeiture is, we accept it. We don't fight the process. He looked at her. That was always going to be the deal. I knew it when I called Marsh. She was quiet for a moment. You've been prepared for this. I've been prepared for this since Wednesday night. He paused. I just needed to be in the room with it to make sure the preparation was real. She nodded. She closed the folder. I'll be with you Monday with the DA. Wednesday with Marsh. She stood. Damien. She paused at the kitchen doorway. For what it's worth, in 22 years of practice, I have not often seen a person choose to lose something they didn't have to lose. I had to, he said. That's the part that took me a while to understand. She left. He sat at the kitchen table until he heard Noah wake up upstairs, the sequence of sounds he was learning to read, the soft complaint of waking, the escalation toward genuine protest, the moment where someone needed to go up before it became something else. He stood up and went. The trial of Gwen Hartley and 3 Halcyon corporate officers opened on a Tuesday in the second week of March. The courtroom was a high-ceilinged room in the Suffolk County Courthouse that smelled of old wood and central heating and the particular institutional gravity of a space where serious things had been decided for a long time. The gallery filled to capacity on the first day and stayed that way. Reporters occupied the designated press rows. Families, some Damien recognized from the expanding case file, others he didn't, filled the rows behind them. Damien sat in the third row on the left side, in a dark suit, alone. Elena was beside Claire Ferris, 3 rows ahead. She had asked him not to sit beside her in the courtroom, not for reasons of distance, she'd explained, but because she needed to be able to focus without managing his reactions alongside her own. He'd said he understood, and he had understood, and he sat in the third row and watched her from behind and thought, she has always known exactly what she needs and been willing to say it. That was the thing he'd spent 3 years undervaluing and 1 catastrophic decision losing and 4 months slowly learning to see again for what it was. Hartley sat at the defense table in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, her hands folded. She was thinner than the photograph in the employment file had shown. She looked at the table surface with the composed blankness of someone who had made a decision about their presentation and was executing it. Damien looked at her for a long moment on the first morning, and then looked away and did not look at her again. She was not the point. The point was in the testimony, the accumulating record of what had happened in the rooms of Brightwell and the other facilities, the evidence that arrived piece by piece over 8 days of proceedings, the documentation that Mara Voss had forced into the public record, and that the DA's office was now forcing into the legal record. The point was the other families, the ones who testified on days 4 and 5, whose children were between 18 months and 4 years old, and whose accounts of what they had found and how long it had taken to find it were specific and devastating and needed to be in a room where 12 people were required to hear them and couldn't leave. Elena testified on day 3. She was on the stand from 9:45 in the morning until 12:20. Damien sat in the third row and watched her walk to the stand and settle into it with the posture of someone who had decided to occupy the space they were given without apology. And he watched her respond to the prosecution's questions with the same careful precision she'd shown in every difficult conversation of the last 4 months, the same complete refusal to be made smaller by the difficulty of what was being asked. She told the court about the first time she had noticed something wrong. She told it plainly, no performance, no orchestration, just the sequential account of a woman who had been paying close attention and eventually saw what was in front of her. She described the bruise on Noah's jaw. She described the drive to urgent care. She described the physician's face. She described calling Damien. She did not cry. Damien had his hands loose on his thighs and his jaw set, and he watched her not cry and understood what it was costing her to not cry, and was grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with knowing, specifically, the cost of a specific kind of control in a specific kind of person. The defense attorney crossed for 38 minutes. He was a capable attorney doing the best he could with an evidentiary situation that had given him very little to work with, and what he had to work with he deployed. The timeline questions, the reliability of memory under stress, the possibility of alternative interpretations. Elena answered each question with the flat, factual patience of someone who had expected all of it and had already been through all of it in her own head 100 times, and was not going to be destabilized by hearing it from a man in a suit. When she stepped down, she walked back through the gate without looking at the defense table, without pausing, without any visible acknowledgement of the weight of the preceding 95 minutes. She sat back down beside Claire. She straightened her jacket. She put her hands in her lap. Damien exhaled a breath he had been holding for a portion of the morning that he could not have precisely identified. That evening, after the guests were gone and Noah was in bed, and the yard was cleaned up, and the house was quiet, Elena sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and Damien sat across from her and they talked. Not about the case. The case was done, or done enough. The verdict's in, and the sentences set, and the appeals beginning their slow process in the background where they would remain. Not about the restructuring or the forfeiture, or the 18 months of financial review that was still ongoing. About other things, smaller things. The things that accumulate in the daily life of people who are trying to know each other again in a different shape. She told him about the Horrick Commission project, which was more complicated than she'd anticipated and more interesting than she'd hoped. He told her about the construction arm's new project in Cambridge, a mixed-use development that he'd taken on specifically because it required him to be in Boston. She told him about something Noah had done that morning that was still making her laugh when she thought about it. He told her about a conversation with his attorney that had produced, unexpectedly, a path through the financial review that was cleaner than Claire had initially projected. They talked until 10:30. Then she stood up and carried her cold tea to the sink, and he stood and got his jacket from the back of the chair where he'd put it at noon and hadn't needed. At the front door, she looked at him. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She opened the door. He stepped through it into the September night, which was cool and clear and smelled of the season, turning over into something else, the particular smell of a year moving from one thing to the next. He walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, looking at the house, the lit windows, the ordinary quiet of a house in the evening, with a child asleep in an upstairs room and a woman inside who had agreed to try something new from the ground up with a man who had given her legitimate reasons not to. He started the car. He drove the 8 minutes back to the hotel with the windows down and the night air coming in, and thought about tomorrow and the day after and the slow, specific, unguaranteed work of becoming something different from what you'd been. Not through a single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of daily choices made in the direction of the thing you'd decided to build. He had spent 20 years building an empire on the understanding that power was the thing that protected you from loss. He understood now that he had it exactly backwards. The thing that protected you from loss was not power. It was the willingness to be known by the right people, fully, without the architecture of carefully managed appearances. It was the willingness to be seen not as you wished to be seen, but as you were, and to let that be enough, and to do the work of making it enough when it wasn't yet. He pulled into the hotel. He sat in the car a moment longer. Then he went inside and went to sleep. And in the morning he drove the 8 minutes back to the Newton house and knocked on the door at 8:15, and Elena opened it with Noah on her hip, already demanding breakfast with the absolute focused urgency of a 2-year-old who has decided that morning is not a gradual process, but an event that requires immediate resource allocation. And she looked at Damien and said, "He's been up since 6:30, with the particular tone of a woman who is tired and glad to see someone. And Damien took Noah from her without being asked and carried him to the kitchen, and Elena made coffee. And outside the Newton house, the September morning was doing what September mornings do, arriving without ceremony, steady and clear, neither asking anything of the people inside it, nor withholding anything they needed. It was, in the end, this simple and this hard, and it was enough.